we left off, or sorry, not last week, but on Thursday, I think we ended up talking about jump seating was the last thing, right?
Right.
Okay. So the next thing is this next FAR, 121.533. This is the only FAR that I know by the number. Just for whoever was asking on Thursday, that you don't got to memorize the numbers. But this is the only one that I know via the number. Like I can always tell you that this is 121.533. And that's only because this is probably, this one is probably the single most important FAR for dispatchers, and probably the most often asked in an interview or test or recurrent classes or by an FAA inspector. This is the one. If there was one that you needed to memorize like word for word exactly as it states, this would be the one. You don't have to do that, but this one is talking about operational control, and anybody that was able to look at yesterday's stuff would have definitely seen a prelude to this, and that's kind of why we talk about that at the same time we're doing FARs. But this is the responsibility for operational control, and this one is specifically referencing the domestic operations. So this says each certificate holder, and just remember certificate holder equals airline. So each airline conducting domestic operations is responsible for operational control. The pilot in command and the aircraft dispatcher are jointly responsible for the pre-flight planning, delay, and dispatch release of a flight in compliance with this chapter and operations specifications. So just in that one paragraph B right there, there were three things listed. And those three things you absolutely need to have memorized. So the pilot in command and the aircraft dispatcher are jointly responsible for pre-flight planning is your first thing, delay is your second, and dispatch release is the third. And you will be asked that question several times every year in some way, shape, or form, whether it be a recurrent test or whether it be in an interview or whatever you're doing. This comes up quite a bit. So the question will usually be, what three things are the pilot in command and aircraft dispatcher jointly responsible for? That's typically how they're going to ask that question. So joint responsibilities, pre-flight planning, delay, and dispatch release. Just delaying the flight. If necessary, if how sometimes we will delay a flight 30 minutes because of weather. Yeah, or we'll sometimes delay it 30 minutes even for crew time. Like if we know that if they push at this time, they're going to go get stuck in like a de-ice line and potentially time out. Sometimes we'll intentionally delay it so that the line dies down and they don't accumulate the block. I mean, there's a whole handful of reasons, but number one would usually be weather, like waiting for a thunderstorm to pass by, or waiting for, sometimes you might not be legal to launch based on the TAF or a METAR. If it's less than an hour flight and a METAR, even if the TAF is legal, but we have a METAR, a current METAR report that shows that the minimums are below our legal minimums for the approach that we want to use. If the flight is less than an hour total, we have to consider the METAR in our legality to launch. Otherwise, if it's over an hour flight, we can disregard the METAR. Even if the METAR was like 0 miles visibility, as long as the TAF was legal and it's over an hour, we could still launch the flight, as long as we have an alternate and things like that. But if it's under an hour, so obviously we have a lot of flights under an hour. So any of our little, Denver Cause, Denver Aspen, even Denver Junction sometimes can fall underneath an hour. But Salt Lake Pocatello, Salt Lake Twin, Salt Lake Ida, out of every hub we have them, Chicago Milwaukee, Chicago South Bend, Chicago Moline, Peoria, Springfield. So we have quite a few flights out of every single hub that kind of fall under this less than an hour thing. But anyway, that's the delay thing. We can delay the flight. As a dispatcher, when you have that operational control, that 50-50 joint operational control, you can honestly delay the flight for whatever reason you want, that you feel is in the essence of safety. Obviously you can't just delay it, to help a friend, make the connection or whatever. But but technically speaking, you just have to obviously be able to demonstrate, that you're reasonably delaying the flight out of the means of safety. Now, obviously, a lot of questions, come up when you look at how the way things operate in the OCC. Typically, it's not the dispatcher that's ever delaying the flight directly, right? Typically, it's the system controllers or the shift manager. That's usually who makes the decision on delaying the flight. But all of those delay decisions that they're making aren't necessarily because of a safety issue specifically, right? So this joint operational control that the dispatcher and PIC have are kind of more related in the aspect of, if everything otherwise is good to go, and as a company we're not choosing to delay the flight for whatever reason, but it could otherwise go, but the dispatcher sees something that, or the PIC, and they talk, obviously, and decide jointly that they need to delay the flight. That happens actually. It doesn't happen a lot, but it does happen, like where as a system controller, I'll get a phone call from the dispatcher that says, hey, just got a phone with the captain. We want to delay this like 30 minutes because of weather. Even if the weather's legal, and they could still launch, a lot of times the system controllers usually aren't paying very much attention to that in the first place, but we get that phone call a lot, and we basically, and that they technically are that final authority, even though sometimes it looks reversed in the room, like where the system controller will proactively decide to cancel a flight or whatever. All of the decisions that the system controllers and shift manager make are like company economical type decisions. And they're free to make those decisions as long as it's not intervening with the safety of the flight. Now, on the reverse side of that, as long as the dispatcher, has a plane that's airworthy, has, weather that's legal, and has a crew that's legal, then, on our side, from the system controller or shift manager point of view, we expect that the flight will operate, unless, at that point it's kind of in their hands. And if they decide at that point to do something in the means of safety, then that is 100% their decision, which is unoverridable by anybody, actually, anybody in the company, even, Tracy Gallo, Brad Blake. Nobody can take that operational control decision making away once it's been given to them, if that makes sense. And if you've read through, if any of you have read through that advisory circular that I put out for yesterday's material, that goes in depth. It talks a lot about how the economics of the business cannot interfere with the operational control safety aspects. So, even though we have, obviously we have a lot of, our goal at SkyWest obviously is to be a profitable company and make money. Those initiatives cannot interfere with decision making from the operational control standpoint. So they have to show the FAA that they have systems in place that, people aren't trying to influence the outcome of flights based on business initiatives. So there's always that fine line, okay? But technically at the end of the day, I think in our OCC, I think we do a pretty good job of, obviously we push our business agenda when everything else is legal and everything else is safe. We're free to push our business agenda. We We try to minimize the amount of fuel we take, because economically, like taking less fuel burns less fuel and saves more money, or tankering fuel if it means that buying gas in Phoenix is going to be less expensive than buying gas in Flagstaff, or sometimes gas is, way more expensive in a certain outstation, so we'll actually fill up all of the gas necessarily in the hub to go out and back so that we don't have to get gas at all in the outstation just simply due to price. We do a lot of that kind of stuff. And, for the most part, it's usually safe. Obviously, taking more fuel is always safe, so that's not really a big deal. But yeah, generally speaking, I think the OCC does a pretty good job of the black and white, like this is legal, this is not legal, and when it comes down to it, if a dispatcher decides that a flight cannot be sent, then really there's nobody in the room, or nobody in the company for that matter, that can really override that decision. So that's why dispatchers are individually licensed by the FAA, is because their responsibility is separate from the business economic side of the company. So that is why the FAA requires a dispatcher to be individually licensed, so that they can individually hold that person accountable for decisions that they make, just like the pilots too, and same with the mechanics. They all technically are governed directly by the FAA. So if something happens with a flight, or we have an incident with a flight, like even the one that I put on there yesterday, right? The Alaska 261 flight, for any of those of you that looked through that and saw it, part of the reason that this advisory circular that I also posted yesterday came out was because of that flight, that crash. That happened in, I think, October of 2000, or maybe November of 2000, but it was deemed that part of the reason that the flight ultimately went down and crashed was the fact that they stopped. Well, part of it, first of all, says that they first had this problem, and how many of you actually looked through it, or how many of you know the history of Alaska 261? Anybody? So the plane, and obviously, if you haven't seen it yet, you'll obviously go through it, but just to make it real kind of short and concise, the flight was flying from Puerto Vallarta to San Francisco. That was the flight path. Once it got close up into like the Carlsbad area, it had up in the horizontal stabilizer in the tail section elevator, it had an issue with the jack screw, and this is an MD-80 that they were flying, but the jack screw, the tail assembly is very similar to like the CRJ tail assembly. Other than ours, a lot of our stuff is now like electrically and hydraulically, actuated in our planes. It's kind of similar to the way the tail, the way it looks. It's called a T-tail, where the, how you see some planes that have the tail up higher on the top of the tail, and then some are down lower, like the 175s, the tail is actually kind of straight out, and the CRJs are up high. Anyway, MD-80s are one of these T-tails, and they have this jack screw component, which ended up failing, or something ended up kind of going wrong with it. But it was ultimately deemed that the long-term maintenance that they had been doing on this jack screw assembly and the tail wasn't proper, or wasn't sufficient enough based on how it's supposed to be maintained and continually inspected. But ultimately, once they had the problem with that, it caused the elevator to flare up, which put them in a nosedive. So they started out in this nosedive because they couldn't control the elevator, and then it started diving, and you can hear them on the ATC where it says, oh, we're in a dive, and then somehow they got it to kind of come around, like where something, I don't know what happened, but temporarily they regained control of the aircraft. I think that maybe something moved and allowed the elevator to come back to normal, you know. So once they dove from like 30-something thousand feet down to about 23,000 in this first nosedive. Once they got down to about 23, they regained control. At that point, they, you know, they started talking. They got on the radio, or the, I don't know whether it was ACARS, the radio with dispatch, and they told them what was going on. But in the relay back from dispatch was they wanted to try to still make it all the way to San Fran. So that was kind of, you know, it was deemed that would be better due to maintenance and personnel. And we do have this same type of scenario that goes on probably every week at SkyWest, probably literally every week, because, and you're going to see it a ton as a dispatcher, where you get a message from a flight or an AirRink phone call or a Delta radio phone call, and they say something is wrong. The procedures nowadays obviously are more black and white, but they'll tell you that something is wrong, and then the dispatcher kind of has to make that decision of whether it's, you know, whether the best idea is to continue, whether it's safe to continue, whether they need to return to where they just took off from, or land somewhere immediate. So a lot of time that usually is put on the dispatcher's shoulders to make that decision. So luckily now, I mean, a lot of our processes have been refined. The checklist items and things like that are more cut and dry. The QRH, the Quick Reference Handbook, that you and the PIC are both looking at are a little bit more cut and dry. Like this situation says divert to the nearest suitable airport. So it's usually, most situations are predefined for what you need to do. But there are a lot of like questionable, well, is it, you know, like where it's like a no icing issue, or whether it's like, whether they have a spoiler issue, or maybe they'll have an issue with an aileron, or a thrust reverser. Any of those issues, a lot of times those things can become questionable. Well, you know, is it causing a big enough problem that we couldn't discontinue? So you kind of have to kind of assess what's going on and kind of just make that decision conjointly with the pilot in command, and then, you know, decide what you're going to do. But in a lot of cases, like, you know, system controllers and the shift managers especially are looking at like the routing of a plane, and they can see, oh dang, if this thing diverts here, then we're screwed. But if we were able to get them to go to here, or if they could at least make it to here, like we start thinking this in our head, it's going to be a lot better. We can recover from it. We've got a spare, like a couple of weeks ago, I think I was telling you guys about it. There was a flight, an E-175 that went DCA to Chicago. Right after they took off out of DCA, they had a no icing issue, and they ACARS'd the dispatcher, and then they said, you know, they said, you know, whatever issue causing, you know, the right wing cannot be anti-iced, and they flat out asked the dispatcher in the message, can we continue? That's what they said. And then the dispatcher wrote back and didn't necessarily address the question directly, but just said, this is Chicago's, he just gave them Chicago's TAP and METAR and said nothing else. And then the pilot responded back, copy, that's it. So there was like no communication back and forth as to whether they could really continue. And it was a no icing situation. And clearly there was, I was sitting there looking at it with Ronnie. So we were sitting at like 37 and 38, and we were looking at it, and we are both, because we're both dual qualified, and we both can clearly see that it is, they cannot continue because it is definitely icing conditions. There was thunderstorms and stuff all around Chicago, and it extended all the way down to like Dayton, Ohio. So half of their route was going to be in icing conditions basically, and we're both kind of just like, are they going to say something, you know? As the system controller, you kind of like, you still want the flight to continue. Not that like we want anything to be done that's unsafe, but we definitely did not want it to return to DCA. That was like in our heads like the worst possible thing. But when we were looking at it, we started to just look at the plot, and we saw that, oh, there's an overnight in Dayton that Dayton ended up being right before the icing conditions was going to start, and so we kind of started talking like, well, worst case scenario, if they start bringing it up like they need to divert or can't continue, then if we can just at least get them to make it to Dayton, then they could divert to Dayton and just swap into the overnight that's already in Dayton. And then Dayton obviously is a lot closer to any of our maintenance bases, but Fort Wayne's only like an hour and a half away. Fort Wayne could easily drive down and fix that plane. Whereas if not, if they go back to DCA, then Fort Wayne or Detroit or somebody's going to have to drive clear to DCA. So anyway, but in the end, the plane ended up going all the way to Chicago. Nobody said another word about it. So, so yeah, they, you know, as a dispatcher, you just can't expect that anybody in the room is going to, you know, even though there might be other eyes on it, nobody is usually going to intervene and tell you that something is wrong unless you are soliciting for that help and that information. Does that make sense? Not that people don't want to help, and not that people won't help. And in some cases, some people will bring it up and say, hey, dude, did you know that your plane's continuing? You know, like if they see that they don't notice it. Some people will do that, but most people in the room are kind of hands off if it's not their plane. And it's not that, like, that they don't want to help, or it's just that they're not looking at it. Like, people aren't looking at your ACARS. You know, if it's the dispatcher, you know, there's a slight chance that the system controller will see the ACARS, like in this case they did. But even me as a system controller, I only filter, when I'm coordinating, I only filter ACARS messages to me, to maintenance, and to crew support. Those are I do not filter the dispatched ACARS because I don't care about them normally. And it's the dispatcher's responsibility to tell me if anything is going to happen, like a diversion. So I could obviously get like forewarned by filtering the dispatch ACARS, but it's not my job. Like, it just clutters my ACARS box. Like, when you have all of these planes, now you're getting every ACARS for my entire hub, and that, like, it just ends up being bing, ding, ding, like message after, like, you end up getting like 25 of them that you haven't even seen, and you're doing 10 other things. It just, you know, you have to basically just rely on people doing their jobs and telling you, you know, the information. I filter the crew support ones and the maintenance ones because on the maintenance side, I know that they will not tell me, you know, usually. And the crew support ones is just simply in case they send one of those messages that says so-and-so is calling off once we get to Phoenix or whatever, just one of those. All of the other ones I don't really care about. And that's really just to get that heads up, because I know sometimes there can be a delay in the crew support ones, like those future sick calls, you know, getting seen, depending on who's over there. Now, if it's you guys over there most of the time, sometimes I don't even filter them, but just depending on who's sitting over there, I will filter the crew support ones. But basically, all I'm really trying to say here is that everybody in the room, when you're dispatching specifically, none of the other dispatchers are going to be seeing your ACARS. And unless you are openly talking about it and soliciting somebody for help or asking somebody a question, there will be no other eyes on that flight other than maybe just you and just maybe the system controller. But typically the system controller, a lot of them do not have dispatch licenses. And so a lot of them are totally hands-off when it comes to, like, obviously assisting in any of those decisions. Some of them are way too hands-on, Kevin Law, you know. But typically, like, even when I'm doing coordinating stuff, I normally, if I know something is just blatantly unsafe, I'll go say something. But like in this case of like this DCA Chicago, and it wasn't even my flight, technically it was Ronnie's, but we were talking about it, but we were, you know, kind of talking like, well, you know, if they start to accumulate ice, then they'll see, and then they can just divert to the nearest suitable. It's not really like an unsafe issue, but it was kind of one of those things where we were rooting for them not to figure it out at the beginning because we wanted them to at least make it to Dayton. And we knew that all the way to Dayton was no icing, so we knew that that wasn't a problem. But, continuing after Dayton technically should not have happened. So, but that's just the way it goes, though. Like, nobody, if he would have come over and asked, then we would have said, yeah, it's not after Dayton. It's clearly icing conditions all the way to Chicago. So.
What did they say in that video? If nobody in the airline business ever broke the rules, then.
Yeah.
The group thing terrible.
They would not make any money.
All of them thinking. It's like, they're crazy. They think they're putting that on me.
Yeah, that video is so old too.
Well, I get kind of messed up because we've been gone for so long.
Well, it's kind of funny too how like those decisions, once they knew what the right answer was, but as the more they talked about it, they talked themselves into really, from the motivation standpoint of not getting in trouble, that's really what motivated them just to continue, because the one guy was supposed to be upgrading the next week, right? And then
the captain's just like, yeah, you can kiss that goodbye, and he just fired right back. He's like, yeah, well, you're not going on your leave now, so you ain't fucking on my upgrade.
Yeah. And those flights are quite a bit different too, with the way that those long over water, they have basically that point that they kept referring to, the DPA. When is DPA? That's DPA stands for in that world. Like, we don't ever see it in ours, but like in long international type flights like that, it's referred to divert to the planned alternate. That's what DPA stands for. But it's the point of no return, though. Essentially, it's where once you pass this point, if you are at that point, you have to make a decision of whether you are legal to continue with the fuel that you have on board. Because what happens in long international flights is, because, like, if I'm going from Salt Lake to Paris, Paris, the forecast is really not going to be very accurate, because the flight, it's going to be 12 hours when I get there, right? So when I'm looking at a TAF 12 hours from now, that weather could be totally upside down backwards as compared to what it says right now, right? So what they do is they dispatch to a certain point, basically. They put enough fuel on the plane to make it, and there are several of these points along the route. But every time they get to one of these points, they have to look at the weather again at their destination and decide. Well, they have to look at it, and then, similar to the 1, 2, 3 rule, they look at it and decide, does this need an alternate? Because a lot of times they dispatch it without alternate fuel, assuming that it's going to stay not needing an alternate the entire flight. But every time they get to a certain point, they have enough fuel on board to get to that point and either turn around and go back to a city, a recent city that they passed over, or continue. But if it like changed to whether they needed an alternate now, then they cannot pass that point unless they have enough fuel on board to plan for the alternate, because then they have to figure out what alternate they're going to use too. So as long as the weather is good, they redispatch the plane every 3 or 4 hours as they pass these points, and they redispatch it. A 12-hour flight can be redispatched like 3 or 4 times basically in flight. And they basically send them a new release saying, okay, from that point to Paris, you just need this amount of fuel, and as long as they have that on board, it doesn't need an alternate, then they're good to continue past that point. If it now needs an alternate, but they don't have enough on board, then they need to divert at that point and stop and get gas somewhere. So that's how these big, long international flights work. Like, a lot of them, if they had to plan to carry the fuel for the entire flight, as well as planning for an alternate, like if you look up the flag rules specifically for alternates, you'll see that flag, in a flag operation, you always have to have an alternate, and you have to then have, I mean, I can look up the rule. I don't know it by memorization, but it's like you have to be able to have on board your aircraft like an additional 15% of the total fuel for the entire flight, plus you have to be able to hold for an hour. I mean, it's a tremendous amount of fuel. But when they end up dispatching, like if you take a 767, like the ones that fly Salt Lake London, Salt Lake Paris, those are all 767s. And that plane is really not that big of a wide-body plane. It could not take all of the fuel that's truly necessary based on the definition of flag operations to actually fly Salt Lake to Paris with the extra required fuel plus the 45-minute reserve plus the extra 15%. Like, it couldn't carry that. It would be payload restricted every single time it left Salt Lake City. But because of this way of launching with a certain amount of fuel based on the expectation that it might not need an alternate as you get closer in, then they can, as the plane is flying, they can reassess and then they can redispatch it at so many points along, because at this point now you only need this amount of fuel, and at this point you only need this amount of fuel. So you're breaking the flight down into like 3 or 4 different sections where you really only need the fuel for those sections on board in order to continue. It has to be under the assumption that you can't pass these DPA points unless you have the fuel on board to make it all the way down. Because at that point, that 15% for the entire flight is now only 15% for that quarter of the section. So the fuel is able to be reduced tremendously because of this redispatching. So anyway, it's really interesting the way it works. But with this one, that video, they just blew through it. They knew the weather, or didn't even look at the weather, knew that it was going to be bad. And then they knew that legality speaking, the true thing they needed to do was divert to Coco's Island or whatever, which is only for emergency only. So they knew that it was going to draw attention if they did it. And yeah, under the pretenses of not getting in trouble and everything else, just risking it, they continued on to Perth, I think is where they were going. But yeah, it's interesting. Back onto the topic of FARs. So there's that paragraph B there. Those are the 3 things that the aircraft dispatcher and pilot in command are jointly responsible for. Now these next things, it says the aircraft dispatcher is responsible for, and these are the individual things. So there's 3 more things here. There's 3 things that you're jointly responsible for, and there's 3 things that you're solely responsible for. These next 3 are the things that are solely the dispatcher's responsibility. Number 1, monitor the progress of each flight. Number 2 is issuing necessary information for the safety of flight. And number 3 is canceling or redispatching a flight if, in his opinion or in the opinion of the pilot in command, the flight cannot operate or continue to operate safely as planned or released. So when you get asked this question, a lot of times this becomes a 2-part question. They'll ask you what 3 items, or they might just say what items are the PIC and dispatcher jointly responsible for. And then in that case you would say pre-flight planning, delay, dispatch release. And you can say it just shortened down just like that. And then they'll ask you what 3 things is the dispatcher solely responsible for. And it just as simply stated as this, you could just say monitor the progress of each flight, issue necessary safety information for the flight, and cancel or redispatch. You can literally just say cancel or redispatch. You don't have to put all the other stuff behind it. That's always been acceptable anytime I've ever answered it. But They can ask you like all of those things together. They could like list this. They might say list the 6 things that are the dispatcher's responsibility, and then after they could say of those 6, which 3 are joint responsibilities with the captain. This question can be asked obviously 10 different ways, but you just need to know the 6 total things, and you need to know which 3 are the sole responsibilities and which 3 are the joint responsibilities, and just have them memorized. The next little part of this, in paragraph D and E, it says each pilot in command of an aircraft is during flight time in command of the aircraft and crew and is responsible for the safety of the passengers, crew members, cargo, and the airplane. Each pilot in command has full control and authority in the operation of the aircraft without limitation over other crew members and their duties during flight time, whether or not he holds valid certificates authorizing him to perform the duties of those crew members. So that is just basically saying that the pilot in command has the final say and is the top authority on an aircraft. And it's basically, that second part is basically saying that even though he is not certified like as a flight attendant per se, or has been trained as a flight attendant, he still is in charge of the flight attendants and has authority over the flight attendants. So, and that's just basically just so that there's, you know, a single person that ultimately is responsible for the entire safety of the aircraft. And in an emergency situation, whatever instructions he issues, whether it be something to the first officer or flight attendants, you know, they're expected to kind of follow his direction, even though he's not trained, you know, in their job. So a lot of pilots will use that little part, you know, to say, well, I'm the one that I'm in charge of the safety of the passengers, you know, like when they're refusing like an APU plane, you know, like there's been a few times where I've called out a captain and I said, you know, I'm pretty sure that if you were to ask the passengers if they want to just go and be warmer in a non-APU plane, that they would still probably just rather go. And then there was one time that came back and said, well, they may want to go, but ultimately I'm the one that's in charge of their safety, you know, and even I have to make that decision on their behalf, not them. So it's funny sometimes. Any questions on that one? That's a big one, a lot of stuff. Got to have all those memorized, the 6 things, that is. The next one we're going to look at is emergencies. It says, in an emergency situation that requires immediate decision and action, the pilot in command may take any action that he considers necessary under the circumstances. In such a case, he may deviate from prescribed operations procedures and methods, weather minimums, and this chapter to the extent required in the interests of safety. It's basically saying that in an emergency situation, the pilot in command can make any decision that he thinks is necessary in the interest of safety. That means that this is referred to as emergency authority. So you'll hear the term PIC authority thrown around a lot in the OCC when you're dispatching, and it's referring to this FAR specifically. It's the authority that the PIC has to make any decision that he wants in the interest of safety. That means, and what it's saying here is that he can break any rule. He can go against what any FAR says, what any company policy says, what any of our operational procedures dictate in the handbooks, any of the policies he can break any of those as long as he's deeming that he's doing it underneath his emergency PIC authority, and it's clearly has to, qualify as an emergency event that he's doing that.
From a legality standpoint, how does that work? Once they're exercising their emergency? Like
legality as far as
like legal aspect thereafter. If basically they just have to say I was acting out of the best interest, even as a dispatcher. You declare something and it's a judgment call. Mm-hmm. Do they come back there?
Well, typically speaking, if it's an emergency, then you have to declare an emergency. So you'll have to declare an emergency with air traffic control. So that will be recorded essentially, right? And then once you get done, you end up having to write a report about it. Anytime you declare an emergency, you have to write a report about it, which has to be, given to the company, and then the company decides whether or not the nature of the emergency qualifies as getting passed on to the NTSB, depending on what happened. But anytime an emergency is declared and obviously most of the time it's the PIC, but whether it be a dispatcher or the PIC doing it, it's still the same routine that they have to go through after everything is kind of said and done. Within the next 10 days, they have to issue a report as to what happened and the reason that they declared an emergency. And sometimes it's obvious that it was an emergency situation. A lot of times we don't necessarily see the result of some of these things, but when you say like legality, like legal to continue flying, or just like legality of being an emergency?
No, like the law aspect, like the criminal law aspect of it after is it protected by the FAR if it's acting out of the interest? Or?
Yeah, like if you deem that you're in an emergency situation, then yeah, you can. You're really, you're going to be protected basically, unless they come back and look and say like, no, there was no emergency here, or figure that he's trying to like cover something else up. Perfect example of this, and this happened, it was before I worked for SkyWest, but maybe it was 10 years ago, I'm not sure, maybe less, but there was a flight, I don't even remember where it was to or from, but basically what happened is the plane came in on an overnight, and you know how, I'm sure anybody that's worked at the airport knows that the plane comes in, obviously, whatever fuel it had on board when it landed is the fuel that remains on it overnight. So the next day, for the first flight of the day, new crew, everything, they come out to the plane, and they get in the plane, and they did everything normal, everything was correct that they were supposed to do, all of their normal startup procedures, and boarded the flight, got everything ready, except for one thing. They forgot to get fuel. So,
minor detail.
Yeah, minor details. So the flight ended up leaving, taking off, and got up into the air, and they realized at that point that they never got fuel. I personally don't know how that happens, but it happened, and I know it's happened probably several times. But they got up into the air, and they realized they didn't have enough fuel, and they realized that they didn't get fuel at all. But the way that they tried to get around it is they declared an emergency, obviously, a minimum. In this case, it's called a min fuel emergency. And they basically said on the radio, like, there must be, we must be having we're losing fuel, or we must be having some sort of a fuel leak or whatever. Later, it was deemed that they knew full well what had happened, and they realized their mistake, and they were just simply trying to cover it up by saying this, and declaring an emergency. But they declared the emergency, got down, and then, later, once everything was realized and they realized there was no leaks in the tank, there was no holes, there was no nothing, right? Everything was working just fine. They just simply realized that they didn't get gas at all, and both of them ended up getting fired. But obviously, you're not going to be protected in those situations where it's just a blatant, but there are those types of situations. Like if you're trying to cover up a mistake you made, some things, obviously you might be able to do that, but in some cases you may not. Like we do have a lot of situations where people will declare an emergency. In fact, I believe we had one yesterday. In fact, it was my flight, not from a dispatching, but from the coordinator side. Albuquerque to Houston, diverted back to, or returned to field in Albuquerque. I don't even know if he declared an emergency or not, but a lot of times in this situation they do. They got up to altitude and they realized, or they didn't just realize, but they suddenly had a pressurization issue where the cabin lost all of its pressurization, basically. Now, depending on what altitude you're at, it becomes the nature of this being an emergency. The gravity of it is higher and lower based on what your altitude is. But I think they were only in the teens. I think maybe 18, 19,000 feet, maybe 20. But they realized that the cabin was not pressurizing at all. So they should have, that's something that they normally should have seen a lot earlier than that. But they didn't see it until almost 20,000 feet. And they immediately sent a message, pressurization issue returning to Albuquerque. And that's all we hear from it on our side. But later it's determined that the pilots on the ground in their pre-takeoff checklist, they did what's called a misconfiguration of the bleed settings. So, and this was a 700. Most of if you remember going back talking about the systems, the 700 has what's called a FADEC in it. The full authority digital control. It basically, the FADEC does all of your settings for you, typically automatically. But they did not set up the FADEC to pre-program all of their stuff for them. In the 200, you have to do all of this manually. You got to push all these buttons for your bleeds and turn them this way to turn on your AC packs, and you start your engine, and then you got to switch your bleeds over to the engines providing the bleed air instead of the APU, kind of how it all goes. But basically, they misconfigured their bleed settings for takeoff, which caused the bleed air not to be going through the packs, which ultimately caused the plane to not begin pressurization. Once it goes above 8,000 feet, the plane then keeps the cabin altitude at about 8,000 feet usually, sometimes down to about 6,000. Between 6,000 and 8,000 feet is what the cabin altitude normally is. But once you go above that, the cabin altitude stays here, and then the plane continues to climb. But that's when the pressurization is starting to kick in, is at that point. So they should have really noticed it.
Did they notice before the flight attendant passed out, or was that what made them notice?
That's
why they came back, because the FF passed out because of it.
Oh, he passed out?
I think maybe that's why they did notice.
Red flag.
Maybe.
She was sitting down, she just slumped over.
Oh, really?
Noticed, and then the other flight attendant. Yeah.
Oh, wow. I didn't even know that happened. I know that they called off, but yeah, I mean, probably that's probably what.
Yeah, the most to crewmates.
And 2 other passengers too, right? Yeah, there was a couple of passengers that passed out too. But yeah, that's I know that she was seen by the oxygen mask did not deploy.
She was right by the door, I think.
Yeah. Yeah, the thing is about when you look at how high an airplane can fly, I mean, most of our planes can go up to 37, 38, 39,000 feet. And we normally will try to fly that high if we can, but the certification on how high an airplane can fly is based on how quickly that airplane can descend to 10,000 feet. That's how all of those performance metrics are based. It's if a CRJ 700 is cruising at 37,000 feet and it suddenly lost pressurization, how long would it take for that plane to dive to 10,000 feet, basically? Because at that point, people can breathe normally without, without any. I think actually it's 15,000 feet is where it needs to get to. But they have to be able to get there in like less than 90 seconds from 37,000 feet. And so they call it a rapid descent, you know, due to depressurization. We had one, if you remember, that was all over the news a couple of years ago, or that E-175 that was flying, that diverted to Buffalo and did that rapid descent. You know, we still don't know why that even happened, but that's what that issue was. It was they were clear up, you know, 30 some odd thousand feet and lost pressurization, or they didn't necessarily. Well, they said that there were people passing out, and then the cabin, the display gave them a pressurization warning, and then, you know, being that high, you have about, when you're at 35,000 feet or higher, you only have literally about, I think they say anywhere from like 15 to 20 seconds of oxygen that you have to be able to get that mask on. Otherwise, you're going to pass out. So the mask's dropped, obviously, in that case. And you only have, literally, at that high, you only have seconds to get that mask on. And if you're helping anybody else get it on too, right? But you got to get it on, and otherwise, you're going to be toast. So now if you're down at like 25,000 feet, it totally changes. You have like a minute in that point. So you can kind of see that that descent is based on being able to rapidly get down to an altitude where people can breathe. And because those oxygen masks only have like 8 minutes of oxygen in them, so, you know, they base it off of that system not working or people not being able to get their masks on. That's why you got to get down really fast. But I mean, when you're rapidly descending like that, it probably feels to the passengers, it probably feels like the plane is like pulling an Alaska 261, like just going straight down. Even though it's totally safe, they can dive at like 7,000 feet, you know, descent rate, like, or even more than that. I think that they said that our E-175 that did that in Buffalo, it was diving at almost 10,000 feet a minute or something. So it's pretty crazy because they got to get down to 15,000 feet. But you think about that, that's like, I mean, that is like nose down like this, you know. So it's pretty crazy. But that's what those, so when you have a pack out, okay, when you have an MEL for a pack, you notice that there's a flight level limitation, right? So in the 700, that flight level limitation is 310. So if you have a pack out, our max altitude goes from 39,000 down to 31,000. And that is simply due also to the same rule of being able to rapidly descend. So with one pack out, the performance of the 700 being able to rapidly descend to 15,000 now only becomes like where they could only do it from 31,000 feet would be so that becomes now the max altitude just because of the pressurization. For the 200 and the 900, the restriction is 250. So they're even worse. If you have a pack out on either of those planes, your max altitude is 250 for the whole flight. The 175 and the 700 are the 31,000 feet as they have better performance. So, but that's where those flight level limitations come from ultimately, is the plane's capability to rapidly descend to 15,000 feet. The 200 and the 900 cannot do it fast enough. That's why their ceiling goes down to 250, because 2.5 is the top for their being able to rapidly descend. So, but yeah, under the emergency authority, the pilot can really break any rule that he wants to, and you know, if it's in the extent, you know, interest of safety, basically, is what this is saying. So a lot of times, you know, we can't necessarily tell a captain to like divert to a certain airport because, you know, the weather might be below alternate minimums and stuff. But we always tell him that, you know, in an ACARS message, we'll say, I can't tell you to go to whatever airport, but you can go there you can decide to go there under your PIC authority. So That's kind of thrown out there a little bit, and that's kind of what it's relating to. Now the dispatcher does have this exact same authority as well. Dispatcher has emergency authority. Dispatcher can declare an emergency and do anything that we just read the PIC can do. The dispatcher can do all of that stuff, break any rule, break any FAR, break any policy, procedure, anything in the manuals. Same deal, as long as it's in the interest of safety. However, for a dispatcher, I don't know if I've ever seen a dispatcher even need to, because it's just, you're on the ground, you're not in the plane. So the only time this would ever even apply to a dispatcher is if you had no communication with the plane at all, and you couldn't get in touch with them, and you knew that there was some sort of an issue going on, and you couldn't contact the PIC to figure out what was needing to happen. In that case, the dispatcher would call ATC and declare an emergency on behalf of his flight, call the authorities around, and declare an emergency there, as well for whatever might be needed. But if the dispatcher's doing it, it's usually meaning that it's probably pretty disastrous for, the aircraft itself. There's been a few situations where this has happened, but they're very rare and very unique. Like, we had a couple of, we had a guy that was flying, I believe he was going Burbank to Denver. I think that's what it was. One of those Southern California cities to Denver. And they got to Western Colorado. Everything was normal. They're following their normal flight plan. Everything's normal and good. But once it got to the point, if you know how the route works, you eventually get to a point where you reach the star, the transition point where you're going from your regular route and you need to start descending. So you're basically at the first point on the arrival route, the star route, and they blew right through it. And, when you have that clearance to, like, okay, you're going to descend via the star into Denver, ATC is expecting that once you get to that point, you're going to start following the flight path that the star dictates on the charts, right? So anyway, he blew right through that, did not start descending. They obviously, the first thing they're going to do is they're going to call him up on the radio and say, hey, SkyWest 5151, you're supposed to be descending, is there a reason you're not, but then there's no response. No response. Then they keep calling him, no response, no response. So after like a few attempts of trying to get him on the radio, if they can't get him at that point, that's when they will call us. So they'll call us and they'll say, hey, they'll usually call, when they call, it usually goes straight to the shift manager, and they'll just say, hey, this is Denver Center. We can't seem to get in touch with your Flight 5151. He's over Western Colorado, wherever. And so it basically becomes that point that we try to ACARS him and get him on the radio there, over the ACARS messaging, just in case he's on the wrong frequency or something and he's just not hearing, or maybe they accidentally bumped it and it made the dial go to, like, one notch up or down or whatever. That happens. It's just human error, right? So, but an ACARS message, clearly that's not going to, there's nothing they can change on that that's going to make our messages not come in. So we will send a message and say, hey, Denver Center's looking for you guys on this frequency. They want you to tune in and acknowledge. And first of all, that, to this point, that exact example probably happens 15 to 20 times a week. Just that. That happens all the time. If you're dispatching a normal 4-day week, you'll probably have it happen to you 2 or 3 times.
Where they blow past there.
Not that they blow past it, but they're just not talking back.
Okay.
Now, the reason that they, in this case, that ATC wanted to get a hold of them is because they blew past it and they weren't descending when they were supposed to be. But there's a lot of other reasons, like sometimes as they pass them off from different sectors, like ATC is like, okay, well now, he comes out of his sector and he's going into like a new sector, so he tells them to, like, hey, SkyWest 51, contact Denver Center on this frequency, but sometimes then they don't. They just misdial it, and then then they're lost basically. So that happens all the time, and typically it's fixed really quickly with just an ACARS message saying, hey, Denver Center's looking for you on this frequency, and then like, oh crap, we thought it was this frequency, and then they'll respond, acknowledge, and then we're all good. In the case though that they don't respond to the ACARS, and then now they're still continuing to not respond on the actual ATC frequency. Now, if you think about it, so the flight now is continuing to fly. It's now passing into like other sectors. So now they're having to like clear out traffic that's in its path because they're at the wrong altitudes and stuff. And so they're going to have to start moving other planes because this plane is just going in a straight line now at the wrong altitude, and where other planes ultimately were supposed to be flying through. So they end up calling us back. And the whole process of this, goes that every couple of minutes, they'll basically call us back, hey, we still don't have them, and then we keep sending messages, and it goes like at this point, I think we were like 15 minutes in at this point, from the first point that they hadn't said, responded to ATC to where they, to where we had been messaging them, as well as ATC trying to get a hold of them. But if about that amount of time goes by, then ATC really starts freaking out. Like they basically have to get to the point where like, okay, like we're gonna, we have to end up calling, who is it that they call? What's their name? It's like the military agency that. Gosh, I don't know why that's slipping my mind.
Ghostbusters right now.
Yeah. Gosh, now it's gonna bug me because I can't think of who it is. But ultimately, they have to, once it gets to a certain point, they have to basically get in touch with like the Air Force, right? And the Air Force has to send up a plane and things like that. So this situation, it was getting to that point. They kept going. They're not responding. They're not descending. They're not doing anything. They just keep going. And eventually they fly right over Denver. Like it was still high altitude. They're like past Denver. Like, this is by far the most dramatic one I've ever seen, but past Denver. At this point now, they, it's basically determined they like launched planes from like Colorado Springs, like Air Force jets, got up there, and the Air Force planes basically get up like right next to the plane, and they could see inside the cockpit, and they could see that they were both asleep.
Oh my God.
Oh my gosh.
When did this happen?
This was like right when I got here, so it was like 5 years ago.
Are you kidding?
Yeah, so they ended up going like all the way. It was like they were into Kansas before they turned around. They just blew right past everything, and they were asleep. And anyway, basically the way they got them. Well, the thing is first when you see this from the outside looking in, the first thing that the biggest fear in this is that they have what's called hypoxia. If any of you have heard of hypoxia, basically where you have rapid decompression of the aircraft, but it's so rapid that nobody had time to respond, and it basically, basically everyone's dead because they just look like they're asleep. So, but the way you can tell from the outside looking in, they train Air Force people to look at this, but if you pull up next to an airplane like that, the first sign that of the hypoxia or the decompression exists is that there will usually be icing around the windows because of the decompression from the inside will create ice on the outside. So that didn't exist though. So they weren't staying. They were like at 33,000 feet. So anyway, basically they then just like ended up buzzing the plane, and I still can't fathom like two people being that asleep,
Well, a flight attendant, nobody like thinking,
Right,
oh, hey,
yeah.
we're flying over the
What
top
point
of
did the flight
Denver right
attendant
now.
think,
Well, the thing is, I mean, there are a lot of those things, but obviously they have no way of communicating, and ultimately, yeah, once they got down onto the ground and passengers reported that, that a lot of them, saw the Air Force jet right off the wing, and luckily this was still just before like Twitter and all these things were big, but I know it was on Facebook and stuff, but yeah, I mean, passengers could clearly look out the window and could hear the Air Force jet. It literally had to buzz the cockpit to get one of them woken up. They both ended up getting fired. But yeah, I mean, you can see how easily things can happen, just like in pure innocence, and that's just on that flight. It's not abnormal for pilots to sleep either. I mean, they're technically allowed to, as long as one of them is, alert and awake. Like back when I used to commute to Atlanta to work for ASA ExpressJet out there, I would often end up on the red-eye flight from Salt Lake to Atlanta that leaves, midnight out of Salt Lake and goes all night, gets into Atlanta at like 6 a.m. But on that flight, and a lot of times when I'd end up in the jump seat, I mean, there were several times where I was the only one awake in the jump seat. I mean, it's never like I felt like unsafe or whatever, but they're technically supposed to like rotate. They'll even talk to each other. It's like, hey, I'm gonna take a 15-minute shut my eyes for 15 minutes. I mean, they'll communicate that, and that's perfectly fine and legal, as long as the other one is. I mean, because they also get up and they go to the bathroom and things like that too. So I mean, that procedure exists for a one-pilot operation. I mean, if there's a jump seater in there, if there's not a jump seater in there, when they do a bathroom break, a flight attendant has to go into the cockpit and be in the cockpit. There always has to be two people in the cockpit. That's kind of a new post 9/11 rule, but like, I don't know if you guys heard a few weeks ago or whatever, like a pilot accidentally got locked out. Like it was a door malfunction, but he accidentally got locked out of the cockpit on a bathroom break, and they could not get the door back open. And the plane ended up landing just fine. The co-pilot was the one in there, and they can land the plane just fine by themselves. It's just that they clearly didn't follow procedure, because it should have been that the flight attendant went in, and then she would have just been stuck in there, and it still would have been the same situation, but the flight attendant then would have just been stuck inside, but no one was inside except the one pilot. So that procedure exists, but it's always supposed to be one person. If there's a jump seater, then the flight attendant does not need to come in. So, but all the time when I was on those flights, like it would just be, one of the pilots would get up and go to the bathroom, and it would just be me and the other guy up there. And, I mean, there was a lot of times when I was just observing from there, just watching, because I can't sleep in planes, like hardly at all. So I was never usually asleep, but I'd see the one would say that he's going to shut his eyes for like 15 minutes. But then it's kind of funny just to watch the other one that's supposed to be the awake one, and I could just watch him over there, and he's just kind of like, just dozing, And there was a point where I even still have the picture where I like took a picture from my phone and it showed them like both asleep. But yeah, it's pretty crazy. I mean, stuff can easily happen is basically, what I'm saying. And then, but a lot of times they'll try and like, cover that kind of stuff up where it's just blatant pilot error, that of dudes doing stuff. So in this case, I believe the reason I was mentioning this whole thing to begin with was because I believe our dispatcher in this situation declared an emergency. ATC can also declare an emergency on behalf of the flight themselves too. And that happens a lot for us, that we don't like it because we have to do extra reports obviously on it. But a lot of times when we are sending a flight in, or if we have a flight that has a mechanical, situation similar to the one like in Albuquerque yesterday, I don't believe that our crew declared an emergency, but a lot of times ATC will just declare an emergency for you without you even asking. So that kind of happens sometimes, but they can do it. But in this case, I think our dispatcher was one of the only times I've ever seen a dispatcher declare an emergency. Most of the other things happen so fast that there's usually not even time. Like if it were a true accident, there's usually not any time for anyone to declare an emergency, like the Alaska 261 situation. You know, I mean, you could hear that they obviously, you know, in the final parts of that, they clearly were not responding to ATC, but everyone around them could see what was happening, right? And the dispatcher in that case knew that there was something going on, but I mean, you know, there's usually not even any time to declare an emergency in those situations, but and it's also obviously a situation probably where normally ATC would just declare the emergency, but yeah, it can get kind of interesting sometimes. When you do enough flights, you know, when you're doing thousands of flights a day, you're bound to have little weird things happen occasionally, you know, just simply from a numbers perspective. I mean, even if it's just a 0.25%, you know, of flights that have issues, you know, you'll eventually, just simply from a numbers game, you're eventually going to see stuff, you know, like the one that we had a few years ago, the one that landed with the landing gear up in LA. I'm not sure if you guys remember that one. I was the coordinator on that desk when that happened, and like sometimes you just have like no time, you know, like you don't have any time to like even like gather yourself. Like I suddenly got a phone call from LA Ops that just said, hey, have you heard anything about one of your planes having sort of a landing gear issue? And at that point, I hadn't heard anything. I'm like, no, I haven't heard a thing. Let me ask around. I just get up and said, anybody heard anything about a plane landing in LA with a landing gear problem? Nobody says a word. And then they tell me specifically what flight, and they're like, yeah, 5010 or whatever from Monterey. And I look up who it is. I call the dispatcher. I'm like, have you heard anything from this crew about having a landing gear issue? And just as fast as I could even ask him, the plane was landing with the wing, with the, you know, the gear up. So it all they did is they realized they were having a landing gear issue as they were. I mean, by the time, the problem is with a landing gear issue, and you guys know it when you're on a plane, it's maybe 30 seconds to a minute before you land that they put it down, right? So you hear it go down, and at that point, you're already, you know, like I said, you're only 30 to 60 seconds away from landing. And so to put the gear down and then realize at that point that you have a landing gear issue is very late in the game, obviously. So the left main gear did not come down, is what happened. And they could see that on their display that they were not getting the left main gear down. And so what they did is they didn't land, obviously, on that first try, but what they did is they told towers, like, hey, we're having a landing gear issue. Do you mind if we just do a flyby so you guys in the tower can visually inspect and tell us if the gear's down? And so instead of just continuing their descent, they leveled off at 500 feet, and then they just flew straight past the tower and did a visual inspection. The tower says, yeah, it looks like your left main gear is not down. At that point, the flight wasn't planned with an alternate. It was, you know, pretty much minimum fuel that we can take. And so at that point, there really is no fuel, you know, to be making any decisions as to like, oh, well, let's see if we can climb back up and troubleshoot it and get it down somehow. There wasn't any time for that because of just the fuel situation. So all they did is once the tower confirmed that the gear wasn't down, they said, okay, we're just going to circle right back around and land. And so it was, after they did that flyby, it was maybe another 45 seconds that they just circled right back, got right back into the pattern and landed. So there was really, we didn't even hear about it until after they had passed the tower. And from the point that I got the first phone call asking me if I knew of any issues, it was under a minute that the plane was on the ground, you know. So it just happens way fast. So, and that obviously was an event that ends up activating the whole EOCC downstairs and all of the fun stuff. But yeah, it just all happens like way quick. So no time really to do much of anything before you even know that it's happening. This one for the dispatcher, it says, whenever a pilot in command or dispatcher exercises emergency authority, he shall keep the appropriate ATC facility and dispatch centers fully informed of the progress of the flight. The person declaring the emergency shall send a written report of any deviation through the certificate holder's operations manager to the administrator, the FAA. A dispatcher shall send his report within 10 days after the date of the emergency, and a pilot in command shall send his report within 10 days after returning to his home base. And that's basically only if you break a rule. So, and that's kind of what it says here. A written report of any deviation, and the deviation means any deviation from the rules or from the FARs. This next one is your engine in-op landing and reporting. This one says, except as provided in paragraph B of this section, whenever an airplane engine fails or whenever an engine is shut down to prevent possible damage, the pilot in command must land the airplane at the nearest suitable airport in point of time at which a safe landing can be made. So going back to all of this stuff we've talked about in planning and performance and stuff, as everybody knows, like we plan everything from a dispatch perspective. We plan everything as if the plane was flying from the origin to the destination with one engine in op, right? We already plan it that way. However, if one engine really does fail, like if it really does end up happening, the FAR states that he has to immediately land at the nearest suitable airport. So it's kind of, a lot of dispatchers will kind of talk about this like, well, why do we have to plan to fly the whole route with one engine in op and drift down and all this other stuff with one engine in op if the protocol is that if an engine really did fail, that we have to land at the nearest suitable anyway? Like, why do we have to prove that we can continue when we can't continue per the rules, right? So anyway, it's just kind of one of those things. It's just, I guess the FAR, the clarification from the FAA comes down and says, well, the problem is you just never know when the engine is going to fail, at what point along the route. So you have to show that the entire route can be flown with one engine in op, just in case it fails at a point where you need to continue to your destination, or maybe that's the most suitable at that point. Or if you're in a point in a drift down zone where you literally can't continue because now your drift down is going to be below the drift down, you know, the 2,000 foot clearance level. And so now you have to have one of those drift down alternates. You got to divert to a drift down alternate. Or if it happens early enough where you can just turn back around and go back to where you took off from, your origin. So you just don't know when it's going to happen. And so, but the protocol is if an engine fails or if the engine is shut down, a lot of times it's not necessarily the engine failing, but let's say they get an engine over temp warning. Well, if they're getting an engine over temp warning, then the protocol in the QRH says that the crew must take that engine and pull it all the way back to idle. And in some cases, after they pull it back to idle, they then shut it down. So depending on the situation, if one of your engines is at idle, you're basically flying on one engine, right? Or obviously if you shut it down, you really are. So anytime that happens, you're always going to see, you know, a plane diverting to whatever the nearest suitable airport is. So this kind of brings up a question. This is kind of something that you need to kind of think about and be able to answer as a dispatcher. But what constitutes a suitable airport? And it's written, the FAR is written this way specifically, where it says the nearest suitable airport. And there's a reason it doesn't just say the nearest airport, right? But the nearest suitable airport. So the question will be asked to you guys, and it'll be, what constitutes a suitable airport for diversion purposes?
That'd be training using like jet aircraft type.
Yeah, well, there's a whole long list of things that you could technically use to answer this question. Like the question will really be, name 3 things or name 4 things that constitute a suitable airport for diversion purposes. And the things you're going to want to answer that with would be, well, first of all, you're going to want it to be an airport that performance-wise you can land at, right? I mean, you're not going to obviously land on a little airstrip that is 50 feet wide and 200 feet long, or something. So it's got to be somewhere where you could actually safely put the plane down and come to a full stop, in an emergency situation. So the way I would sum that whole thing up is just be, from a performance standpoint, an airport that the plane could safely land at, depending on, that would be like runway length and width, Then a lot of the other things are just going to simply depend on the nature of the emergency and the nature of why they're diverting. But let's say it's a medical emergency. Well, if point A option is kind of a small podunk town, but if you go 5 or 10 minutes further, it's kind of maybe a bigger town that has more medical facilities, then that might constitute a more suitable airport to divert to for, medical. So, personnel and equipment on the ground, the availability of medical or even in this case, medical or like firefighting personnel, if that were needed. Like if you have an emergency to where that, like let's say you have an issue with your landing gear, like if you have an issue with your landing gear and you need to land, obviously you're going to want to land at an airport where they can have fire trucks out there sitting there on the sides of the runway to spray you down if you end up landing with a gear up, or if you end up landing in any sort of a situation that might cause fire, smoke, or issues with your brakes or anything like that. You're not going to want to land at an airport that doesn't have ARF availability, basically. So airport rescue and firefighting availability, medical availability, even maintenance availability would be another one. Another would be just passenger service availability, and that would just be like an airport operations perspective, or even you can go as far as even saying like maybe even like a jetway, depending, like if we have an E-175 that had to divert to the nearest suitable airport for any reason, then the E-175, unless it has a jetway, it cannot, you either have to have a jetway or you have to have stairs, and most places I would probably predict that most random airports aren't going to have stairs that are exactly the size that you need for the E-175. So it would probably be pretty rare. The only other thing would be, you're going to need a jetway. So, having a jetway so that people can actually deplane without having to blow the slides. Anything out of those you can list. It really just depends on the nature of the emergency, but the nearest suitable airport usually is never the closest airport. That's what it ends up being. And the other thing about that too is if an airport is directly underneath you as compared to like an airport that's 50 miles in front of you, the one that's 50 miles in front of you is probably closer than the one that's right underneath you, just simply because by the time you descend down, unless you just do a circular rapid descent downward, but then you'd still would have to go around and line up to land. But by the time you do all of that, the other airport, if you had just descended down and just lined up and landed, is probably quicker. So just know that the airports right underneath your position aren't necessarily the closest ones or the best ones for that matter. So just be able to name, 3 or 4 things to answer that question, basically. Okay. This next one here is dispatch authority, domestic operations. Except when an airplane lands at an intermediate airport specified in the original dispatch release and remains there for not more than 1 hour, no person may start a flight unless an aircraft dispatcher specifically authorizes that flight. This particular rule is, all it's really saying is that if a flight lands somewhere, if it was an airport, if it lands at an airport, and this is basically talking about a flight that it's not landing at the destination. Like if you had a flight and you had an alternate on that flight, and that flight ended up diverting to the alternate for whatever reason, if it was the alternate that was listed on the flight, then as long as the plane landed and took off within an hour's time, you wouldn't necessarily need to give it a new dispatch release. It could just resume its flight. That's what the FAR says. Now, for our purposes at SkyWest, we always, anytime, we always do a new release, regardless, even if it's going to be a 5-minute stop. We always do a new release no matter what. But the FAR, if asked, it just means that the question that you'll see will be, if a plane lands at an intermediate stop, how long can it be there? Or it will say an intermediate stop specified in the original dispatch release. How long can that flight remain there without needing a new dispatch release? And that answer is 1 hour. That's for domestic operations. For flag operations, it is 6 hours. Same criteria, 6 hours. Now, if a flight diverts to an unplanned alternate, or if it wasn't an airport that was specified on the dispatch release, then it's going to need a new release no matter what. This is only in the case that it diverts to an alternate that was already planned on the release, or an intermediate airport. But at SkyWest, we do not fly what are called the intermediate stops. We don't do those. When I was at Great Lakes, all of the dispatching that we did they were 2 leg releases, is what they were. So we'd have a flight that would go like Denver to Cheyenne, and then just Cheyenne right back to Denver, kind of like the same way most of our hub network works, out and backs. But at Great Lakes, you could actually send the release as it being Denver, Cheyenne, Denver. So it would actually, so that once they got to Cheyenne, as long as they weren't on the ground for longer than an hour in Cheyenne, they didn't need to get a new release to return back to Denver. So the only thing they had to get was new weather in Cheyenne. They just had to get a weather packet. So we always used to send the release out of the hub, and they would never need a release in the outstation. So it would just be, it would go to the outstation, and we would send a weather packet to the outstation people, and they would print it. And once that flight got in, they already had their release to go back to the hub, but the station people would just hand them the weather packet, and then they would be good to go. Maybe need fuel, but typically they were good to go. We tankered most of our fuel out of Denver, so it was it's kind of rare because there's very, very few operations where you'll see that they actually do it that way, where this particular FAR even applies. They also had like milk run type flights where we would have it would go Denver to Farmington, New Mexico, Farmington to Page, Arizona, and then Page to Las Vegas. That whole thing is one dispatch release. So the whole thing, it would show Denver, Farmington, and then the next line would be, Farmington, Page, Vegas. And it would all be one release, but every time they got to one of those cities, you just needed to give them a new weather packet, and then they also couldn't be on the ground longer than an hour. But as long as they did that, then it complied with that. But like I say, at SkyWest, we don't do anything like that. Every single flight, every takeoff and landing is a new dispatch release, whether it be a diversion. The only milk run flights we even do now, in fact, the only one I can even think of is the Denver, Jamestown, Devil's Lake. That's the only one that I think would even be like that. We could obviously do it on the out and back flights, which is like most of our flying, but yeah, we don't do it at all. Every single flight that we have has a brand new dispatch release regardless. So this really never comes into play for us no matter what. But it will be asked though, and it is probably, I'm sure you've seen that on the ADX prep. So the domestic rule is 1 hour, flag rule is 6 hours.
Would supplemental fall under those, or just depends on where that flying would be?
Well, the very next FAR here that's not highlighted is actually talking about the supplemental ones. No person may continue a flight from an intermediate airport without a new flight release. So in supplemental, they call it a flight release. In 121, it's called a dispatch release. So, so that's why it refers to it as a flight release here. But if the aircraft has been on the ground more than 6 hours, so just blanket 6 hours for supplemental. That's the other thing too, is when you see us do flights at SkyWest, when all of our 121 passenger flights will all say dispatch release on the top. Anytime we do a repo flight, they all say flight release because it's not 121. So, and it'll also, 121 doesn't have, or supplemental, they're not called dispatchers either. They're called, they refer to them in the FARs as flight followers, but on a repo release, it'll say flight release, and then it'll just say contact name, Jake Wilkinson. But all of the real ones, like 121, will say dispatch release, dispatcher, Jake Wilkinson. So you can't refer to it as a dispatcher or a dispatch release unless it's 121. It's kind of their little rule. Let's see, because it says on the release, what rules you're flying under, and obviously dispatch release with a dispatcher denotes that you're 121 rules. So if it ever gets pulled by the FAA, they want to know what part are you operating under, for that particular flight, so that they know what set of rules you have to abide by. This next one, familiarity with weather conditions. Domestic and flag operations. No aircraft dispatcher may release a flight unless he is thoroughly familiar with reported and forecast weather conditions on the route to be flown. Pretty straightforward, pretty obvious. Aircraft dispatcher information to the pilot in command for domestic and flag operations. The aircraft dispatcher shall provide the pilot in command all available current reports or information on airport conditions and irregularities of navigation facilities that may affect the safety of flight. Before beginning a flight, the aircraft dispatcher shall provide the pilot in command with all available weather reports and forecasts of weather phenomena that may affect the safety of flight, including adverse weather phenomena such as clear air turbulence, thunderstorms, and low altitude wind shear for each route to be flown and for each airport to be used. During a flight, the aircraft dispatcher shall provide the pilot in command any additional information available of meteorological conditions, including adverse weather phenomena, clear air turbulence, thunderstorms, low altitude wind shear, and irregularities of facilities and services that might affect the safety of flight. So this is just basically saying from top to bottom, when you plan the flight at the beginning, you, on your dispatch release, are going to provide all the weather information available for your route of flight that you're flying, as well as all of the things listed. If any of them exist, you need to most of this stuff is automatically put on the release. When you do a dispatch release, it automatically sends a weather packet with it that has the METARs and the TAFs for your origin destination, for your alternate, as well as any convective SIGMETs, any regular AirMets, any PIREPs, anything that it can see that is on this route, it automatically puts it in there. Now, as an aircraft dispatcher, it's telling you that you need to do it. It's kind of done for you automatically, right? The only thing that you need to specifically look at is like any particular items that you specifically want to call out to their attention, maybe a little bit more clearly than them having to surf through a weather packet to find stuff. So if there's something that you really want them to have their attention drawn to, then you'll actually put it in your remarks section on your dispatch release, and it'll just say, hey, convective, watch out, tops are at flight level 500 in this area, as well as, lightning, thunderstorm advisory or tornado warning type stuff. You can kind of put any of your own thoughts and opinions into the remarks section of stuff that you specifically want to call out. Now that's the dispatch release. You get that all prepared, you send that. Obviously weather changes, right? As we send our dispatch releases anywhere from 60 to anywhere from 1 to 2 hours before the flight leaves on most cases. So obviously there's a lot of time in there that weather will change, right? And weather forecasts change even before the flight has even left. If something dramatically changes before the flight leaves, if you remember me talking about this the other day, it's the dispatcher's responsibility to monitor the weather at the origin and the destination and en route all the way up until the point of the point of dispatch. And that's the point, like I said, it's pretty much more or less the out time of the flight, but it's really specifically when the pilot sends his manifest, his takeoff manifest, which sometimes might be a little bit before the out time, sometimes it might be a little after the out time, but it's roughly right around the out time. So you, if your origin goes from not needing an alternate to needing an alternate, and it changes before the point of dispatch, it's the dispatcher's responsibility to update that release and tell them, hey, this is the release, unless it has an alternate on it, is now not legal. And it's your responsibility to watch the destination specifically, look for TAF changes, and make sure that you amend your releases if you need to add an alternate, because that'll also usually necessitate that you need to add fuel as well. So on Fusion, and a lot of this stuff you'll be trained and learn, but on Fusion we actually set up these alerts. Fusion automatically will watch for TAF changes at the destinations. It's first, when you get on Fusion, you can click what desk you're on, and then Fusion knows that all of these flights on your desk are your flights. Yeah, there's a lot of stuff that you guys probably haven't seen that it does, that it can do, but if one of your destination TAFs changes at all, and that doesn't necessarily mean, it might be changing from good to better, or it might be going from good to needing an alternate, any direction. If the TAF gets amended at all, you can set it up to get an alert. Because it is, if you don't have alerts, I can promise you that nobody is good enough to sit there and do all of your work and then keep going back, because it could change. You could look at it 1 minute, it could change the next minute, and you might not even look at it again for 20 minutes. So there's no way. You would have to constantly just be going up and down, up and down, up and down, like just as fast as you could do it if you really wanted to do it, appropriately and save yourself from busting an FAR. But Fusion will tell you, you'll get a pop-up that just says, hey, LA TAF changed, and it'll show you the TAF. And you can quickly look at it and like, oh, that needs an alternate now. And then a lot of times you don't necessarily remember what your ETA was, so you got to go back to that flight, look at your ETA, and then just see if you need to change it. Sometimes you'll have 5 flights that are going to LA, and you got to hurry and change 5 flights, to needing an alternate. So
is that something that just gets sent to them through ACARS then?
No,
or is that?
Yeah, well, it can either way. depending on what they need, depending on how early it is, like if that TAF changes right, literally like they're about to push and it changed, you're probably just going to send it over ACARS. You can send a full release right to their ACARS printer and it can print out. But the big thing is, though, if it's a situation where they're going to need to add fuel, then you're probably going to be taking a delay at that point because you got to add fuel. Now, if it just happens to be luckily, enough that if it happens to be a city that we do tankering on, you probably in those cases will already have the fuel on board, because those tankering cities, we usually have the fuel to go out and back. So if you got that fuel already on there, then you definitely have fuel to add an alternate, right? You got an alternate that you could come all the way back if you needed. So that's one thing that's really nice about tankering, is that if you have to amend something and it needs more fuel, usually that fuel's already on board. So it's kind of cool. Dispatchers, generally speaking, love tankering. So because when we don't tanker fuel, the dispatcher, if you're adding anything more than standard fuel, like just the regular fuel, and we're going to look at what regular fuel is. It's going to be one of those things that we're going to talk a lot about. But if we're doing anything more than just standard fuel, then we have to put a reason why we're doing it. We have to quantify our reasoning for adding additional fuel more than what the flight really requires. But when we tanker, you don't need to, because it knows we're already tankering. And so dispatchers, everyone loves extra fuel. So pilots love it, dispatchers love it. I guess if it's a tankering city, then even, the management likes it too. But so that's obviously from the point you do the dispatch release, you send it, you got to monitor it all the way to the point of dispatch. But then even after the point of dispatch, once the plane leaves, gets up into the air, if anything changes, it's still the dispatcher's responsibility for the entire flight to update the pilots on what's going on. If the destination suddenly turns to, crappy and it doesn't look like anybody's getting in, then we need to stay in touch with our crews. Now, if the flight leaves, going back to that whole point of dispatch thing, if the point of dispatch, say it comes 2 minutes before a TAF got amended, and let's say it's a situation where the TAF got amended to it now needs an alternate. If your plane's point of dispatch was 2 minutes before the TAF got amended, then you're fine. You technically do not need an alternate. Your flight is still legal. As long as the point of dispatch was before the change of the weather, then you're legal. So just remember that. That's the first thing you're usually going to look at, is the ACARS client shows you the point of dispatch time, and then you just look at the amend time on the TAF. If the point of dispatch came first, then you're good. You're still legal. But if it's the other way around, then you got to stop them and you have to amend it. So when it's in the air, obviously, a plane can continue to the destination as long as it left before, as long as the point of dispatch was before any weather changes. The plane can then go taxi out, take off, and it can be headed towards an airport that otherwise needs an alternate. Not necessarily always the best thing to do, right? But depending on what the weather change was, like let's say that it changed to forecasting broken 2500 to broadcasting 1900, right? Like barely needing an alternate, just 100 feet underneath the 2,000 foot threshold. Well, broken 1900 isn't going to be any sort of a problem with any pilot getting in. So they're never going to need an alternate in those situations, but it just depends. Obviously, if it fell down to illegal visibility, then you're going to want to make other plans. But yeah, this FAR is just basically saying you got to update everything along the flight, like when it's flying, before the flight, pre-flight, during the flight, anything that comes up. It's the dispatcher's responsibility to monitor the weather and update the pilot in command as to what's going on. Any questions on any of that? Okay, well, let's take a break then. that's pretty much exactly the way it's supposed to work with, with decision making, between the crew and the dispatcher. It's supposed to be pretty similar. A lot of the stuff that they said in that video, in the Antarctica one, was the same exact stuff that you're going to see, like decision making over ACARS, like state the problem, state this, all the different solutions and make a decision, basically, So, well, back to the FARs. This next one is communication and navigation facilities. Let's see. Except as provided in paragraph B of this section, for a certificate holder conducting flag operations, no person may dispatch an airplane over an approved route or route segment unless the communication and navigation facilities required by 121.99 and 121.103 for the approval of that route or segment are in satisfactory operating condition. It's just basically saying that the communication and navigation facilities along our route need to be operative. So that kind of goes in conjunction with how we check NOTAMs and things like that. If because of technical reasons or other reasons beyond the control of the airline conducting the operations, the facilities required by those two FARs are not available or over a route or route segment outside the United States, the certificate holder may dispatch an airplane over that route or route segment if the pilot in command and dispatcher find that communication and navigation facilities equal to those required are available and are in satisfactory operating condition. That's really just talking about outside of the U.S. though. Dispatch release under IFR or over the top. Except as provided in 121.615, no person may dispatch or release an aircraft for operations under IFR or over the top unless appropriate weather reports or forecasts or any combination thereof indicate that the weather conditions will be at or above the authorized minimums at the estimated time of arrival at the airport or airports to which dispatched or released. So this is the FAR that is your legal to go FAR. So the FAR that we looked at on Thursday about the 1-2-3 rule, that's obviously whether you need an alternate or not. This FAR is specifically the legality to launch at all. If you do not have weather conditions that will be at or above the authorized minimums at the ETA, then you cannot dispatch the plane. You cannot send it. So in this case, you wouldn't take off at all. The flight would not operate. So,
Dumb question, I'm sure you've been over this before, but over the top is, what does that mean?
So over the top basically means that you're flying over what, like you still are in VFR conditions, but you're flying over IFR conditions. So it would be like a situation where like underneath you is IFR, like, like the sea, it just happens to be that you're flying above the cloud ceiling. And so it still looks nice and pretty where you're at, but if you were to go drop down below you and try to land it wherever's right below you, you would be in IFR. So it's considered IFR over the top. And that's basically just the reason why they state it like that is because if you're flying in VFR operations, that means that you always can have a visual perspective of the terrain and like the airports nearest to you for you to make a landing at if needed. When you're doing over the top, you can see, you still have all that unlimited visibility, but the problem is you cannot see the ground. So it's basically a situation where you are flying in VFR, but you can't see the ground, like because of weather. So. So when it talks about the authorized minimums in this FAR, those authorized minimums are the landing minimums for whatever instrument approach you are planning on using. So if you know that the airport you're going to has a standard ILS and it's operative and available and the wind at the time of arrival favors landing on that runway and using that ILS, then you would know that your authorized minimums are 200-foot ceiling and half-mile visibility. That's the standard ILS. So that's something that you'll become, very familiar with as well, just standard ILS minimums. But that's the minimums that this is talking about. If it's below a half mile or below 200 feet, if that was the ILS you were planning on using, then it's not legal to launch. This next one is alternate airport for departure. So this is referring to what is called a takeoff alternate. If the weather conditions at the airport of takeoff are below the landing minimums in the certificate holder's operation specifications for that airport, no person may dispatch or release an aircraft from that airport unless the dispatch or flight release specifies an alternate airport located within the following distances from the airport of takeoff. For aircraft having 2 engines, not more than 1 hour from the departure airport at normal cruising speed in still air with 1 engine inoperative. So this is a takeoff alternate, not to be confused with a destination alternate or a drift down alternate or any other type of alternate. This is a takeoff alternate. So like the first time people learning about this think about like takeoff alternates, they always kind of ask, well, why in the world would I need a takeoff alternate? It's usually the first thing that's kind of thought of, because you're already on the ground, right? So why do you need an alternate? So takeoff alternates are simply only in the situation that the weather where you're taking off from, if the weather is bad enough that you could not take off and then circle right back around and land, that's what constitutes a takeoff alternate. Now, the reason why this can happen is because takeoff minimums are usually much less than landing minimums. So you can take off in a lot worse weather than you can land in. Like we can take off, for SkyWest purposes, we can take off in weather all the way down to 600 RVR. Whereas the lowest we can land in, if we're shooting a Cat 2 approach and everything, would be down to 1200 RVR. But in some airports that don't even have Cat 2, then the lowest landing minimums for us is going to be 1800 RVR. So quite a big difference between 1800 RVR and 600 RVR. So you get into this situation where you can take off, but if you had an emergency or if you had an engine failure, you could not circle right back around and land because it's below your landing minimums, but it was still above the takeoff minimums. So that's the reason why takeoff alternates exist. It's simply just if you lost an engine or had any sort of a medical emergency, any emergency at all, where normally you would just immediately land right where you just took off from because it's obviously going to be the closest suitable airport. But if the landing minimums are, or if the weather's below landing minimums, then you can't land there legally, so you need to list an alternate that complies with what it says in the next paragraph, where it says, not more than 1 hour from the departure airport at normal cruising speed in still air with 1 engine in op. Obviously it throws the 1 engine in op there because the situation that this assumes is that we always plan everything 1 engine in op anyway, so obviously it's going to throw it in there, but the biggest reason this exists is in case an engine failed. So you have to plan it. That would be usually one of the only reasons you would be going to your takeoff alternate. Now, when we say 1 hour from the departure airport at normal cruising speed, it's up to the airline to individually decide what distance that equals for their planes based on their performance. So for SkyWest, The CRJ 700 it basically ends up being 300 nautical miles is what they say. You could list any airport within 300 nautical miles of the departure airport, and it could constitute as a takeoff alternate. So takeoff alternates still, need to meet certain requirements for weather and stuff that we're going to look at here later when we look at alternate minimums. But yeah, 300 nautical miles is what you have to plan it at. That's what the airline seems to think, that the CRJ 700 can go 300 miles in an hour with one engine in op. So sometimes your takeoff alternate, depending on how far your flight is, but if you're on a really short flight, a lot of times you can just list the takeoff alternate as your destination. So if it qualifies, if it's less than an hour, it's less than 300 miles, Chicago, Milwaukee, Milwaukee's good. Milwaukee is the destination, but it could also be the takeoff alternate too. So you can kind of kill two birds.
You still have to list it just as a formality?
Yep. And takeoff alternates have no effect on fuel either. So if you need to list one, if the weather at your origin is bad, like if it's not necessarily to where it needs a takeoff alternate, but if it's bad to where, like, it's possible that, once I send this release over the next hour or so, the weather might get worse and then need one, to save yourself from having to do like a new release or an amended release later, save yourself the work. If you think that the weather is trending bad enough to where you just want to add one, you can add takeoff alternates all day long, left and right. It's not going to change your fuel at all, because your plane is already going to be fueled to go to the destination. So it's not going to change anything, because the takeoff alternate has to be within an hour, and most of our flights are going to be over an hour, obviously. But even when you consider like your reserve fuel and everything else that you already have on board, there is no situation where adding a takeoff alternate on any flight that we dispatch at SkyWest would ever add to the fuel that is already needed if it didn't have one. So I always like to consider takeoff alternates are kind of like free. They're not going to add fuel. They're not going to do anything. The only thing that a takeoff alternate will ever do is just save you from having to do extra work later. Because if you add it precautionarily initially on your first release, just in case, if it doesn't end up needing it, great. It doesn't need it. It's not like you had to add fuel for it. It was really just something you wrote on the release or printed on the release. Other than that, it does nothing to your release. It doesn't change any aspect of like I said, the performance, the fuel, the weight, nothing. So, but if you didn't do it and then you got to do it later when he's out there sitting on the taxiway, number 2 in line for takeoff, then it's a little bit, not going to change anything then either, because they're not going to have to go back and get fuel. But just the formality of having to do an amendment, send it over ACARS, blah, 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 have him pull off to the side, and then have him get the new release. Obviously that's going to take more time than it would have if you would have just put it on initially. So anytime any of our big hub airports or even the outstation airports, if they're even anywhere remotely close to where it's possible that they could get fogged in or it might fall below the landing minimums, I just throw takeoff alternates on there. If it's within, even a mile or a half of a mile of the minimums, I just start putting takeoff alternates on, because like I say, it takes 2 seconds to do it and it saves you probably 10 minutes, down the road. So like I say, they don't change anything either. So the other thing too is that putting a takeoff alternate on there, a lot of times it helps the crew know where you would want them to go in the case of an emergency. So Like for instance, like on a short flight where you end up listing the destination as the takeoff alternate as well, a lot of times pilots wouldn't even think about that. You know, they would take off, and then they have something go wrong where they need to divert. A lot of times they're not going to even realize, because it's so abnormal thinking to think that the destination is my takeoff alternate. But once they realize, hey, it's within an hour, it's got good weather, or this, you know, and everything else qualifies, then, you know, why not? That's where everybody in the back wants to go, so you might as well just go, you know. So, yeah. It's kind of weird, though, to, like I said, it's just weird to have, when it looks, the way it looks on a release, where you have a takeoff alternate and the destination are the same, because you would think that you wouldn't even need it in that case. But you have to list it underneath the takeoff alternate column in order for the flight to be legal. So that's one you gotta know, though, and gotta memorize. Obviously, it's in the red box. So, but the big thing there is just that you'll get a question that just says, like, you know, what, and I think you get ADX questions on this too. It's like, what do I need, or, you know, what is the reason that I would need to add a takeoff alternate? You know, and you have to be able to explain, well, this is the reason why. And then you might be another question just saying, like, what are the qualifications for a takeoff alternate? You know, then you have to say not more than 1 hour from departure, normal cruise speed, in still air, one engine and op. So you got to be able to know all those things. So this next part is just recovering our the 1, 2, 3 rule that we already looked at. Alternate airport for destination, IFR, or over-the-top domestic operations. No person may dispatch an airplane under IFR or over-the-top unless he lists at least one alternate airport for each destination. So you remember how when I was talking about this the other day, and I was talking about how they like to pose this question backwards? If you read the first line, the only difference about the one that we read from Part 91 the other day as compared to this one in 121, the 121 regulation is the one that says no person may dispatch an airplane under IFR or over the top unless he lists at least one alternate airport for each destination. If you just stop right there, that's that line that basically tells you that every flight you file under IFR needs an alternate. That's why that question, like, where, you know,
That's from 1, 2, 3, right?
this is the 1, 2, 3 rule, but this specific part on that first line is that part that I was saying that if you get asked, you know, when does a flight need an alternate? The answer is always, yeah, every flight needs an alternate. And then the next part is kind of the unless. It says when the weather conditions forecast for the destination and first alternate airport are marginal, at least one additional alternate must be designated. However, no alternate airport is required if for at least 1 hour before and 1 hour after the estimated time of arrival at the destination airport, the appropriate weather reports or forecasts or any combination of them indicate that the ceiling will be at least 2,000 feet above the airport elevation and visibility will be at least 3 miles. So yeah, that's just really just a review of the other one we already looked at. The only other part in this one that may be worth mentioning is it says when the weather conditions forecast for the destination and the first alternate airport are marginal, at least one additional alternate must be designated. So this is basically saying that if you have a destination, if the weather is below, you know, what it's saying here, the 2,000 feet, 3 miles, obviously you need an alternate. We already know that. You need to add an alternate. But if you add an alternate that also has marginal weather, it's the way it refers to it in here is marginal weather, okay? Now, what is the definition of marginal weather? Well, that is kind of the FAA left the airlines up to decide that on their own. So every airline individually says to us, this is what marginal weather is. So for SkyWest, marginal weather means below landing minimums. To me, that's just poor weather. But SkyWest is saying their definition of marginal weather is below landing minimums, which means the flight's not legal at all, right? So it's basically saying that in that case, if the weather at your first alternate is marginal, then you need to add a second alternate. So, but based on this, obviously we're never going to add our first alternate. We're never going to add an airport as our first alternate that has weather below our landing minimums, right? I mean, that's really counterproductive. So this pretty much never, for us, really never comes into play, this particular FAR, as far as, well, the middle part of this FAR, I should say. The 1, 2, 3 rule part, obviously, is every single release. But that second alternate thing, the marginal condition, that never comes into play for us because we never list an alternate in the first place that, by our definition, is marginal. There is situations where we add second alternates that we'll talk about later on, but I don't want to confuse it with any of this stuff because it by itself is kind of a, what do we call it, kind of just very confusing to talk about. But anyway, 1, 2, 3 rule here, so everybody should kind of already know this. Just in case you're curious, alternate airport for destination, the one when I was talking about like those long international ones, this, just if you wanted to know, this is what it says for the flag operation flights. So for flag operation, you have to have an airport. The flight is scheduled for not more than 6 hours, and for at least 1 hour before and 1 hour after the estimated time of arrival at the destination airport, the weather reports or forecasts or any combination indicate that the ceiling will be at least 1,500 feet above the lowest circling MDA, if a circling approach is required and authorized for that airport, at least 1,500 feet above the lowest published instrument approach minimum, or 2,000 feet above the airport elevation, whichever is greater. The visibility at that airport will be at least 3 miles or 2 miles more than the lowest applicable visibility minimums. So it has a whole slew of, if it's a flag operation, the alternate requirements totally change. And you don't need to bother yourself with any of this. You just need to know the domestic ones. But it's quite a few additional things there. And we're going to look at either of those. Okay, so alternate airport weather minima. Except as provided in 121.624 for ETOPS alternate airports, no person may list an airport as an alternate in the dispatch or flight release unless the appropriate weather reports or forecasts or any combination thereof indicate that the weather conditions will be at or above the alternate weather minimum specified in the airline's op specs for that airport when the flight arrives. Now, that this is obviously the specific 121 rule. So if you remember the Part 91 rule that we looked at, where it said for Part 91 flights, the weather minimums are that the 602 for a precision approach and 802 for a non-precision approach. That was the first one that we read that I was kind of telling you applies for Part 91, but it does not apply for Part 121. So this is the 121 rule, and it's basically telling us to refer to the airline's op specs, which we will refer to it once we get done with the FARs, and we'll look and review at that point what the alternate weather minimums are for alternate airports when we plan them, because it's different, obviously, for every airline. So this is basically just saying that it has to be at or above the alternate weather minima specified in the op specs. So we will refer to that later. Continuing a flight in unsafe conditions. No pilot in command may allow a flight to continue toward any airport to which it has been dispatched or released if, in the opinion of the pilot in command or the dispatcher, the flight cannot be completed safely. Unless in the opinion of the pilot in command there is no safer procedure, in that event, continuation toward that airport is an emergency situation as set forth in 121.557. If any instrument or item of equipment required under this chapter for the particular operation becomes inoperative en route, the pilot in command shall comply with the approved procedures for such an occurrence as specified in the certificate holder's manual. So pretty straightforward on this one. It's just basically saying that we can't continue toward an airport to which it is deemed unsafe. I mean, that's pretty obvious. I don't think most people would do that unless it was the only option available, right? Going back to the little movie that you guys watched, the groupthink movie, right? They chose to continue to Perth. Was it the safest option available? No. But if it was, I mean, clearly they didn't have fuel to turn around. They didn't have the fuel to go back. The only option they really had was to declare an emergency and go to Cocos Island. But they disregarded that. But if Cocos Island didn't exist, then yeah, in that case, the only situation would have been to continue to Perth under an emergency declaration. According to this, that's what they would have needed
I
to
wonder
do.
how frequently pilots just don't mention anything when they screw up and just go for it.
Yeah.
That happens a lot. They just don't mention anything to anybody and just go on down, chill out.
I'm sure it happens a lot. The thing is that, and we're about to look at fuel here, a couple of FARs down in just a little bit, but based on fuel requirements, there's a lot of misconceptions about what kind of fuel you actually need in order to, continue a flight into an unsafe situation or continue a flight when the weather changes and now needs an alternate, things like that we're going to actually talk about. But there are plenty of situations. In this situation, like in the situation of that movie, I think that was probably before the time of dispatchers really communicating with the planes, but the dispatcher, honestly, in that case, should have been one of the very first people that actually contacted the flight and said, hey, you can't pass DPA because now the weather dropped and, you need to divert it, to an alternate before passing DPA. But obviously that didn't happen. But that's what the idea is nowadays. So for a dispatcher, they know if they have a long-haul international flight, they know exactly where those DPA points are. And at every one of them, they start getting an alert that they need to check that aircraft's fuel, check the weather, and make sure that, because they literally have to redispatch the airplane at that point. So they're basically getting ready to send them a new release electronically while they're in the air. So that's what they do. So obviously the dispatcher is already automatically looking at all of these things because they're redispatching the plane. Inoperable instruments and equipment. No person may take off an airplane with inoperable instruments or equipment installed unless the following conditions are met. An approved minimum equipment list exists for that airplane. So pretty straightforward there. We have an MEL list which is approved that we go off of. So let's go down to the next one. Operation in icing conditions. No person may dispatch or release an aircraft, continue to operate an aircraft en route, or land an aircraft when, in the opinion of the PIC or aircraft dispatcher, icing conditions are expected or met that might adversely affect the safety of flight. No person may take off an aircraft when frost, ice, or snow is adhering to the wings, control surfaces, propellers, engine inlets, or other critical surfaces of the aircraft, or when the takeoff would not be in compliance with paragraph C of this section. Takeoffs with frost under the wing in the area of the fuel tanks may be authorized by the FAA. Except as provided in paragraph D of this section, no person may dispatch, release, or take off an airplane or take off an aircraft anytime conditions are such that frost, ice, or snow may reasonably be expected to adhere to the aircraft, unless the certificate holder has an approved ground de-icing, anti-icing program in its op specs, and unless the dispatch, release, and takeoff comply with that program. The approved de-icing, anti-icing program must include the items below, which we're not going to go over. The only thing that we need to know here is that we do have an approved ground de-icing, anti-icing program. Dispatchers don't need to know anything really about it or how to do it. It's really more for the crews and station personnel that de-ice the aircraft. We just have to know, and we're not necessarily in charge of whether an aircraft gets de-iced or not either. The crew makes that decision. The crew visually inspects the plane and decides on their own if they need de-icing or not. So they can forego de-icing if they don't think that anything's on the wings and control surfaces. But basically this is just saying there's kind of two parts here. If a flight encounters icing en route, or if a flight is being dispatched and will be expected to encounter icing along its route, that would be, in this case, we're literally talking about severe icing, because almost all of our flights at some point or another on their, like, I wouldn't say all of them, but the far majority of our flights any time of year almost always encounter icing conditions on every single flight. Now the only question here is that we really have to be concerned with is whether it is severe icing. So in this case we're specifically talking about like a severe icing SIGMET, like when we were looking at weather, icing SIGMETs. If you have an icing SIGMET along your intended flight path or the route that you're planning on filing, then you have to, as a dispatcher, you have to get in and show that although there's a SIGMET, that no severe icing is actually occurring along the intended route of flight. The way you do that is just by soliciting PIREPs from other planes that are maybe in that area, or looking at PIREPs that already exist even from other airlines. So that's basically the mainstay of how you get past that. So, but if you do not, if you have a severe icing SIGMET along your route of flight and you have no way of finding out whether or not severe icing is actually occurring, because we're looking at two kind of different things here. An icing SIGMET does not necessarily mean that it's occurring. Just because a SIGMET exists, it might cover this big broad area, and that SIGMET means that icing, a SIGMET always, first of all, if you remember, is always in the severe category. So if it's a turbulent SIGMET, icing SIGMET, you know, any SIGMET at all, it means severe. Whatever it's talking about is severe. Severe turbulence, severe icing, you know, like dust SIGMETs, anything like that, convective SIGMETs. It always is severe. So severe icing SIGMET, it means, it's considered to mean icing that is severe enough to adversely affect the safety of flight. All other icing, moderate icing, light icing, all of that, it does not adversely affect our flight. We have the systems on our plane to effectively anti-ice the plane and keep ice off the wings, off the tail, off of our control surfaces. So it's not a problem. The only question is just whether severe icing category, specifically inside of a severe icing SIGMET, If you have no way to prove that it's not happening, then you cannot fly on that route. But if you can get some PIREPs and show that, ask people that are flying through that area whether or not icing is occurring, and then they can issue a PIREP for us, then we can go ahead and fly that route. But like I said, just because a SIGMET exists does not mean that it's occurring at everywhere inside of that SIGMET. It might be occurring in parts of it, but not necessarily all of it. SIGMET is just simply saying that it is possible that it could happen, but not that it is happening. So there's that we have to do, and then secondly is just that, and like I said, the second part is the crew's responsibility. They have to visually inspect the plane and decide whether or not they need to be de-iced before they take off. But that's up to them. The only thing that we do in conjunction with this as dispatchers is that if we know that an airport is de-icing, we will take a look at the average, because we can look at an airport and we can see what the average taxi out is for like the last 2 hours. And we'll know that if Chicago is de-icing, then the average taxi out time is going to be longer than our normal standard taxi out. So the only thing we would do in this situation is we might add some extra fuel for their taxi out, because we know that it's going to be longer than normal. That's all. Because we don't want their taxi fuel to, if we only plan the normal taxi fuel, but they end up taking an hour to push back, go de-ice, and all that stuff, then they're obviously going to burn more than the standard taxi out fuel, and then that fuel is going to burn into what you were planning for them to have during flight. And it's possible that it might eat in to the point, if the taxi out delay is long enough, and you guys have probably seen this, a lot of times if we don't plan the right amount of fuel for de-ice delays, a lot of times those planes get out there for an hour and a half, and they could otherwise take off in like 10 minutes, but they have to leave the takeoff line and they got to go back and get more fuel because they fell underneath the minimum amount of fuel required now to actually fly the route. So very unfortunate situation, and really that just comes strictly down to bad dispatching if that happens. So the only time it might be acceptable is if they weren't dispatched, or if they weren't de-icing and then just suddenly started and you didn't know that when you sent the release, but that's pretty rare. So all of that information is available to you, within a few mouse clicks to find out, what are the Chicago taxi out delays? What are the Denver taxi out delays at any given moment for the last 2 hours? You can see that, and then you can just put on enough fuel to equal that same amount of taxi out time. Because we all know what happens when they return to gate to get more fuel. It ends up taking more block time and causes all the other problems too. But that's pretty much all we need to know with that one. This next one is original dispatch or flight release, redispatch, or amendment of a dispatch or flight release. A certificate holder may specify any regular, provisional, or refueling airport authorized for the type of aircraft as a destination for the purpose of original dispatch or release. No person may allow a flight to continue to an airport to which it has been dispatched or released unless the weather conditions at an alternate airport that was specified in the dispatch or flight release are forecast to be at or above the alternate minimums specified in the operation specifications for that airport at the time the aircraft would arrive at the alternate airport. However, the dispatch or flight release may be amended en route to include any alternate airport that is within the fuel range of the aircraft as specified in 121.639. So what this is saying is if you send out a flight release that has, the destination and everything needs an alternate, and you already have it on your dispatch release, that as the flight is headed towards the destination, if the alternate ends up, if the weather at your planned alternate ends up falling below the required alternate weather minimums, then you cannot continue the flight unless you find a new alternate that has minimums, that has weather that is above the minimums. Does that make sense? So it's telling us here that we can change that alternate while it's en route, and we can just do an amendment over ACARS while it's flying and change it. However, we have to still change it. If we can't continue the flight unless we do change it, first of all. And secondly, we have to change it to something that obviously we're not, if we're flying in the airplane, we're not in a situation where we can add fuel. So we got to change it to an alternate that's not only legal, but also within the fuel capabilities of what's already on board the aircraft. So a good example would be when you plan alternates, first of all, it's not always the best practice to list the alternate. It's not always best to list the closest alternate, even if it's good weather. It's usually not a good practice to list an alternate that would be considered like the closest one to your destination, right? Let's say if you are going anywhere to Chicago, just as an example, and you could really use this example of any hub, anywhere to Denver. We can look at a few different ones here, but let's say you're going anywhere and you're from anywhere to Chicago. Chicago needs an alternate. You know that at the time of doing the dispatch release, so you list Milwaukee. Milwaukee is probably the #1 listed alternate for Chicago if it's legal to list, right? And honestly, Milwaukee is probably the preferred diversion airport by everyone for Chicago. Like if I have a plane going to Chicago and it has to divert, my first choice would be for it to go to Milwaukee, personally, However, because Milwaukee and Chicago are so close, oftentimes that if Chicago's having bad weather, sometimes Milwaukee is going to also be having bad weather, or is potentially going to have weather that may not meet alternate minimums, because alternate minimums are not going to be ever as good as landing minimums or destination minimums. So just know that the alternate has to be held to a higher standard than your destination. Okay? And that's because you're planning the alternate as your backup. So if you're planning a backup that's worse than your destination, then that's pretty obviously counterproductive. So, but the other problem with this philosophy of listing the closest in alternate to your destination, even if it's legal, it's very possible that as you're flying to the destination, that Milwaukee might become the alternate minimums might fall below what you need in order to maintain it as an alternate, right? If that happens, and it's also the airport that's the closest one to Chicago, that just means that you have now narrowed your options for alternates down to where it was only Milwaukee, because you put on fuel for the closest alternate. So now that basically, if you can't use Milwaukee and you have to change the alternate, you do not have the fuel on board to change it to anything that's further out because Milwaukee was the closest one in. So a good practice for dispatchers is, even if you intend on using Milwaukee, even if you know in your head that if we're going to divert, the first option in our head is going to be Milwaukee, you'll usually still list an alternate of, say, like Madison or Green Bay, or going to the south, you might list Moline, Peoria, Springfield, South Bend, depending on what direction you're coming from. There's a pretty good science. Like, the best dispatchers honestly have a really good science that they use in their head for picking alternates, and the best dispatchers that effectively do alternate planning the best by far have the least amount of diversions, have the least amount of problems overall. If you're planning, if you continually plan the closest in alternate, let's go back to the same thing where you planned Milwaukee ends up falling below your alternate minimums. Now you have to change the alternate en route. The problem is with that is you can't change it en route to anything but Milwaukee. So you just basically now have caused that that flight cannot continue to Chicago without diverting somewhere and getting fuel. But if you had chosen, say, something like Madison, Madison on the alternate list is within the range. There's obviously a lot of close-in airports to Chicago, but if you list Madison, then by listing Madison, it means you have the fuel for Madison. You also have the fuel for Milwaukee. You have the fuel for Peoria. You also have the fuel for South Bend. So now you've got 4 or 5 options that are all within the Madison fuel range. And so if you need to change your alternate, you now can pick from maybe one of the other 4 or 5 that are an option. So that's a good practice to just keep as a dispatcher, is don't plan the closest in alternate fuel-wise. You know, there might be situations where you have to, you know, because you're bumping people off the plane and things like that. There will be situations that comes up that you have to plan a close-in alternate. There's also situations where if the alternate, if Chicago's weather is just simply like a broken 1800 or a broken 1700, that's not bad weather, right? You're just having to list an alternate more because of the rule than you would really ever need one to, that you're not going to divert under those situations though. So those we refer to as paper alternates, and it's really just, you're just listing it because you have to have one on paper, but you really don't need one, if that makes sense. In those situations, it's okay probably to list the closest in alternate, because if you can realistically determine and conclude that you're not going to divert, then that's okay. But if there's a chance that you might divert, if you are second guessing, Chicago weather, and there is a lot of reasons to second guess any big hub airport, at a moment's notice, you can get them holding for no reason at all. They can be holding just simply because of traffic, not even weather, just because of too much traffic, and any other stupid reason you can think of. So if there's any possible reason that you think that you have any decent chance of potentially diverting, then you almost never want to go with the closest in alternate as far as fuel planning goes, just to avoid limiting your options. The other thing with alternate planning is if your flight is coming from, try to plan alternates that are going to be along your route, if that makes sense. Like, a lot of people will do this planning where they go Salt Lake to Chicago and they put on Detroit as the alternate, right? That's way past Chicago, obviously, first of all. But in addition to that, if you are going to end up holding, like if you have a plane going into a hub and it's going to hold, it's always going to hold from the direction that it's coming in. It's going to, like, if you're coming in from, the northeast into Chicago, well, then they're going to hold you on the northeast of Chicago. So if you need to divert in those situations, having an alternate that's more or less in the area that you would be holding is going to be the best fuel-wise, because you're probably going to be already right above it. But if you have to divert and then fly clear over to Detroit or something on the opposite side of the city, and in a lot of cases on the other side of the weather that you might be dealing with, like if you got to go through thunderstorms to get to your alternate, that doesn't make a lot of sense. And I know you guys have seen on Fusion those big lines of thunderstorms that are, pick an alternate that's on the side that you're coming from, if that makes sense. A lot of people will pick an alternate, which ultimately means they still got to fly through the line just to get to the alternate. It doesn't make sense. And then, not to mention, once they get on the ground in the alternate, that thunderstorm line is right behind them coming in. And then they got to sit there on the ground and wait for the thunderstorm to go over. So just use a lot of common sense. Like when you pick alternates, have it go to somewhere where it's not, hopefully the thunderstorm has already moved through and is moving away, plus have it be hopefully on the side from the direction you're flying in from, so that you can conserve fuel and you could use more of your fuel to actually hold instead of having to do a 200-mile divert to your diversion. And then secondly, or thirdly, I guess, don't try and eliminate planning the closest in alternate. Yeah.
Isn't there a bar or something that says like you need to plan for the, like fuel-wise for this alternate?
Mm-hmm.
And is that only when you plan for multiple alternates throughout your route, or like?
More or less. We're actually going to look at it here.
Okay.
I think it might be the next one. But yeah, when you plan, whatever alternate you list on the release, you have to have fuel for that alternate on your release. But the kind of the key ingredient here is that if you're listing Madison and it is the fourth closest alternate, that means if you got fuel for Madison, that means you've got fuel for Madison and anything that's closer than Madison. And in that case, Milwaukee, South Bend, I mean, there's several that are also, so it just is kind of just meaning that if you've got, when you look at the list, when you pull up your alternate, it lists them in order of how close they are. So the further you're down the list, the further away it is. So you know that if you go halfway down the list and pick that one, you've got fuel for that one and everything above it on the list, basically. So it makes it pretty easy for you, but it's just kind of the common sense planning is all. A lot of the funny thing is even on weather diversions, a lot of the diversions you see are, you know, if you were to go back and look at like statistics, it's a lot of the same people have the majority of the diversions. Not to say that everyone still has diversions, because a lot of times it has more to do with the crew than it even does your planning. You know, a lot of times crews, even though you gave them all this hold fuel and all this extra fuel, a lot of times they just divert without using any of it at all. There's been crews that have diverted and landed and didn't even need to get fuel. Like, if that doesn't even make any sense at all why that would ever happen, but it happens. Like, they had so much fuel when they diverted that they still didn't even need to get fuel at the diversion station in order to relaunch and go back. Like, it just, if that's happening, then it's pretty pitiful. But there's a lot of things you can control and a lot of things you can't. You know, some crews are just going to divert and you're going to find out after they've already diverted, you know, and some crews are going to ACARS you and ask you and actually solicit your opinion. The majority of the time, I would say the dispatcher is the one who decides where you go, but there are those 10%ers out there that don't even tell you what they're doing or where they're going to go or even ask you or even care. So, you know, it's the same 10% that have all the other problems too. So, but this is basically saying that you need to do an amendment en route and change the alternate to something that is legal, has the weather minimums, and is also within the fuel range that the aircraft already has on board. If you can't do that, then you're going to have to stop and get gas somewhere. Okay, fuel supply. There you go, Marin. Next one is fuel supply all domestic operations. No person may dispatch or take off an airplane unless it has enough fuel to A, fly to the airport which it is dispatched, obviously. Thereafter, to fly to and land at the most distant alternate airport where required for the airport to which dispatched, and scroll down, thereafter to fly for 45 minutes at normal cruising fuel consumption, or for airlines who are authorized to conduct day VFR operations in their op specs, that really doesn't apply to us, that second part, so don't even read it. So, fuel supply. You'll get asked this question. ADX, practical test, and it's just one of those ones that you'll see several times a year. But if the question will just be asked, what is the required fuel supply for domestic flight? And that's just going to be to fly to the airport to which it is dispatched, then to fly to the most distant alternate, and then fly for 45 minutes at normal cruising fuel consumption. And that's it.
What about holding fuel?
Holding fuel is that's holding fuel gets added only if the dispatcher decides. So there's a lot of flights that don't require hold fuel, so it's not part of the required fuel supply unless you make it part of the required fuel supply. So a lot of people will refer to an acronym when using this, and that acronym is BAR H, is what they say. And that BAR H acronym includes the hold fuel, but just remember that the hold fuel is optional. You don't have to put it on there. Every flight, though, absolutely has to have the B. So the B in this BAR H is burn off. The burn off is to fly to the airport to which it is dispatched. The A is the alternate. The R is the reserve. And then the H is hold, if there is any. But that's your choice. But for sure, every flight will have BAR, and some might have BAR H. But just remember, if you ever are trying to refer, if you get asked this question, that's what you need to remember, BAR H. And yeah. And then the way you need to state it, though, is to fly to the airport to which it is dispatched, and then fly to the furthest alternate. So it's more like fly here, and then fly here, kind of, you know, not like fly here to the alternate, but fly to the destination and then to the alternate. And then after that, still have 45 minutes of normal cruise speed fuel consumption available.
So it's burn off, alternate, reserve, and holding?
Yep. Now the reserve fuel, just a quick mention about that. The reserve fuel is obviously for unplanned situations. You cannot plan to use the 45-minute reserve fuel. Like, you can't pre-plan to use it, and you can't, like, if the plane is in the air and you're going towards your destination, and like in the situation of the alternate changing, or like, you know, if your alternate weather goes below alternate minimums and you need to change the alternate, you can't ever plan to use any of the 45-minute reserve that you have on board. That never will be able to be counted as using part of it for alternates or holding or anything else. Like, the legality is that you need to land all of your flights with at least the reserve on board. That's what it should be. That if you have to plan to do it that way. That doesn't mean that you cannot use the reserve fuel, but it cannot be something you plan to use, if that makes sense. If you get into a situation, like take our little Perth, Australia situation, right? If they get into a situation where there are no other options and they need to continue to the destination or whatever they need to do, but that is going to mean that they're going to have to burn into the reserve, that's unplanned. So you're kind of looking back, I mean, I know you guys deal with a lot of planned and unplanned, you know, for the extensions and stuff like that. So I wouldn't say it's necessarily the exact same as that, but if the flight's in the air and it needs to use the 45 minutes reserve because it's the safest thing to do, then they can use the 45 minutes reserve. They're not going to have any FAA ridicule or anything like that. You can land a plane as long as you have enough fuel on board to land the plane and taxi off of the runway, or even just come to a complete stop on the runway and then you ran out of gas. It's within the FARs. It's just that you cannot plan to use it ahead of time. That's all. And even when they're in the air, you can't make a plan going forward in the air that would use that fuel. It's really for emergency situations and completely unplanned events. It doesn't mean they need to declare an emergency in order to use it, but they just can't plan to ever use it. There's a lot of situations, though, where you might need it, and you know, people use it. A lot of crews look at that 45 minutes as like unusable fuel. It's not unusable. It's just, it's there for unplanned things. That's it. So The next one is factors for computing fuel. This has 4 items, and you're going to want to memorize these. Each person computing fuel for fuel required for the purposes of this part shall consider the following. So the factors for computing fuel are A, wind and other weather conditions forecasts, B, anticipated traffic delays, C, one instrument approach and a possible missed approach at the destination, and D, any other conditions that might delay landing of the aircraft. So I just always remember this. I just always say wind and weather, anticipated traffic delays, one instrument approach and a possible missed approach at the destination, and then any other thing that might delay the flight. But same thing. All of these that we've been looking at recently are all ADX items. They're all stuff that will probably be asked in a practical. They'll probably be asked in your interviews. They'll probably be, every one of these are, there's like probably 7 or 8 FARs that are like the most common ones that you'll just get asked in interviews, tests, and everything. And this is one of them, as well as like the 1, 2, 3 rule, the fuel supply one that we just did, the takeoff alternate thing. Let's see here. This one is, I'm going to scroll back to this for a second, back to their factors for computing fuel. So all of this stuff is done, like the wind and weather is done for you when you do the release, because our dispatch programs, they calculate your wind and all of that stuff already in the release. It's not something that you necessarily have to do. Our releases are already automatically planned for an instrument approach to be used at the destination. And when you, and they also include a missed approach as well. When you plan an alternate, it always includes planning a missed approach automatically in the fuel. So a lot of these things, just by you selecting certain things, will automatically do this for you. The only thing on this, the only 2 items that you really affect here are B and D, anticipated traffic delays, which you personally would just decide how much fuel you want to add for that, and then any other condition that might delay the landing of the aircraft. You would just decide on your own. So the other 2 are done for us. This next one is weather minimums for takeoff and landing. This is just saying that no pilot can begin a takeoff in an airplane under IFR when the weather conditions reported by the U.S. National Weather Service or a source approved by that service or an approved source by the FAA are less than those specified in our op specs or parts 91 and 97 of this chapter. If the certificate holder's op specs do not specify takeoff minimums for the airport, then we have to go off of what it says in part 91 and part 97. Now our op specs we do have takeoff minimums and landing minimums that are listed in there, which we'll review later. So we don't use the standard ones. Then it says, except as provided in paragraph D of this section, no pilot may continue an approach past the final approach fix, or where a final approach fix is not used, begin the final approach segment of an instrument approach procedure at any airport unless the U.S. National Weather Service or a source approved by that service or a source approved by the FAA issues a weather report for that airport. at airports within the United States and its territories or at U.S. military airports unless the latest weather report for that airport issued by the U.S. National Weather Service or a source approved by them or the FAA reports the visibility to be equal to or more than the visibility minimums prescribed for that procedure. For the purpose of this section, the term U.S. Okay, well, that probably don't need to read. So this is basically saying that when a flight is headed towards an airport, they need to get a weather report prior, like the current weather report, prior to beginning the final approach, or if they're shooting an instrument approach, before they pass the final approach fix. They've got to get like a weather report either from the tower, from the ASOS, from anybody, even if it's the dispatcher sending it on ACARS, however it may be. Obviously, this kind of goes back to the only times we run into problems with this is when, you know, we have an ASOS out and we're going to like a place that doesn't have a tower. That's a reason why they wouldn't be able to land, is because they can't get a, you know, and no weather observer. Therefore, they couldn't actually get a current weather report right before, you know, they passed the final approach fix and stuff like that. Also, they also, when they're shooting an instrument approach, that weather report that they get right before passing the final approach fix has to include visibility that is at or above the minimum visibility needed for that approach. So if they get a weather report, but it's at a quarter mile and they need a half mile, then they cannot pass the final approach fix. They just have to hold until they get good enough weather. So there's several conditions here. There's one that the weather might be too bad. There's one that the ASOS might be down. You might not be getting a report. But basically, in order to go beyond the final approach fix, you need a weather report, and that weather report needs to be at or above the minimums you need to land. That's all. That's kind of saying. Landing weather minimums. So this is talking about high mins captains right here. I know you guys have dealt with this. If the pilot in command of an airplane has not served 100 hours as pilot in command in operations under this part in the type of airplane he is operating, the MDA, which is the minimum descent altitude, or the DA/DH, or DA is decision altitude or decision height, and visibility landing minimums in the certificate holder's op specs for regular, provisional, and refueling airports are increased by 100 feet and 1/2 of a mile, or the RVR equivalent. The MDA or DA/DH and visibility minimums need not be increased above those applicable to the airport when used as an alternate, but in no event may the landing minimums be less than 300 feet and 1 mile. However, a pilot in command employed by a certificate holder conducting operations in large aircraft under Part 135 may credit flight time acquired in operations conducted for that operator under Part 91 for the same type of airplane up to 50% of the 100 hours. So this is basically just saying if a pilot does not have 100 hours of overall flight time in the type of plane he's operating, then we have to add 100 feet and 1/2 of a mile to whatever landing minimums we are planning on using. And after that it says that under no condition can those landing minimums be less than 300 foot ceiling and 1 mile visibility. So if you were to take a standard ILS approach, that 301 figure comes from a standard ILS approach, which is 200 feet and 1/2 mile. So if you have a high mins captain that wants to shoot a regular standard ILS, then you take the 200 and 1/2, which is the standard minimums, and add the 100, so now you're at 300, and then add the 1/2. That's where they get 301, because high minimums captains, the best approach they can ever shoot is an ILS, and then if they're adding 100 and 1/2 to an ILS, that's where they're going to get the 301. But regardless of what approach they're shooting, that's just as the best case scenario, right? That doesn't mean it's necessarily what we're going to have. If they're shooting an approach that's not a precision approach, not an ILS, let's say they're shooting just a VOR straight in, and the minimums for regular non-high mins captains, let's say, are 500 and 1.5 miles, then we still have that 100.5 to those minimums. So it would be 600 and then 2 miles for a high mins captain. So whatever the minimums are for the approach you want to use, you got to add 100.5 to those. That's basically what it's saying. And under no condition could they ever be less than 301. And that's simply because high mins captains cannot shoot Category 2 because they're not authorized. And that means that they're limited to Category 1, which the best case scenario Category 1 is the 200.5, but you still got to add in the 100.5 in addition to it. So does that make sense? High mins captains, just remember the terms 100.5. And then if they ask you what are the absolute minimums they could ever be, just remember 301. We are going to finish FARs today. Okay. Okay, next one is applicability of reported weather minimums. In conducting operations under 121.649 through 653, the ceiling and visibility values in the main body of the latest weather report control for VFR and IFR takeoffs and landings and for instrument approach procedures on all runways of an airport. However, if the latest weather report, including an oral report from the control tower, contains a visibility value specified as runway visibility or runway visual range, RVR, for a particular runway of an airport, that specified value controls for VFR and IFR landings and takeoffs and straight-in instrument approaches for that runway. So it's basically saying that the most recent METAR for an airport is always going to be controlling weather report for the current conditions that either allow people to land or take off. That's what it's saying. If you're at an airport that has a control tower, now a METAR, as you guys know, is only issued once an hour unless there's a specie, right? So it's not like you have METARs being issued every minute, you know, that you're using and for takeoff and landing. You have the ASOS. The ASOS does report to the minute. You know, if you are tuned into it, it is reporting to the minute. So whatever the ASOS is saying is going to be the controlling weather report, even though it's older or newer, I should say, than the last METAR. Whatever the ASOS currently says will be your official weather report to either allow you to land, allow you to take off, or use the instrument approaches. Now, the other thing that it's saying here is that if you get a report of RVR for any runway, RVR is always going to be runway specific, okay? If you get an RVR report, it is going to trump anything else. It'll trump the ASOS, it'll trump the METAR. It is like the #1 controlling, if available, it is the #1 controlling weather product for immediate takeoff and landing. Obviously, we don't use it, you know, in the forecast and things like that, but if you are if you're trying to take off and land right now, RVR, if available, will be your #1 weather product. And that's because runway RVR, the RVR sensors are literally on the runway. They're along the sides of the runway, and they shoot lasers up and down the runway, and they read those lasers. So obviously it's going to be the most accurate visibility for the runway. If you're going off of the ASOS, it's going to be wherever the ASOS is. And if you're at a big airport, the ASOS might be half a mile on the other side of the field, right? So it's just basically saying this because RVR is by far the most accurate visibility report that we have. But it's not available everywhere. So if it's not available, then we do go off of whatever the ASOS says. or the control tower, if they're there and staffed. Does that make sense? Responsibility for the dispatch release. Each airline conducting domestic and flag operations shall prepare a dispatch release for each flight between specified points, based on information furnished by an authorized aircraft dispatcher. The pilot in command and an authorized aircraft dispatcher shall sign the release only if they both believe that the flight can be made with safety. The aircraft dispatcher may delegate authority to sign a release for a particular flight, but he may not delegate his authority to dispatch. So this just gets summed down to one thing. Well, two things. Every flight that's operated under 121 rules has to be authorized by the PIC and the dispatcher. Both people. Can't just have one, got to have both. If one doesn't sign off on it, it can't operate. The PIC is obviously physically there in the plane, and he can actually sign off on the release there. The dispatcher is obviously, depending on where the flight's being conducted, usually going to be hundreds, if not thousands of miles away. So obviously the dispatcher cannot be there to sign a release physically, in the plane. So this is basically saying that the dispatcher can delegate his authority to sign a release, but he may not delegate his authority to dispatch. It's basically saying you are the one that has the authority, even though you're not physically there. By you hitting the send button on your dispatcher release software, once you prepare a release and hit the send button, hitting the send button is basically you signing the release or you authorizing the flight. If a dispatcher doesn't authorize the flight, a dispatch release would not even show up to be printed at the station at all. So if there's a dispatch release available, then that means that the dispatcher authorized the flight. Now, if you send a release and then later realize that you need to revoke that, but you've already sent it, then you need to call the station and tell them to rip up the release or do whatever they need to do, but it's no longer valid. Or ACARS the plane and tell them that. Or, luckily, if it's before you've sent a release, you just simply don't send the release, because the flight can't go anywhere if you don't send the release, regardless of what anybody says. So it's just, if you get asked the question, it just basically says an aircraft dispatcher may delegate his authority to sign a release, which really doesn't mean anything because you don't really sign it. Nobody signs it. Yeah, digital, yeah. And may not delegate his authority to dispatch. I guess back in the day, somebody at the station would just sign it like on behalf of the dispatcher because he wasn't there. But the dispatcher was still in control though, even though somebody else, pen and inked it for him. But that doesn't happen now anyway, so it's kind of an outdated FAR. But they still might ask you the question. You can delegate authority to sign, but you cannot delegate authority to dispatch. That's all it really comes down to. And every flight has to be authorized by a PIC and a dispatcher. They both have to believe that the flight can be made safely. Next, dispatch release contents. So these are the 5 things. Yeah, there's 5 things here. It has 6, but the 6th thing doesn't really need to be included. The dispatch release may be in any form, but it must contain at least the following information concerning each flight. The identification number of the aircraft, which is the tail number. The trip number, which is the flight number. So tail number, flight number. 3 is departure airport, intermediate stops, destination airports, and alternate airports. And you can sum that up by just saying all airports, or even just airports. airports intended to use or something. You don't got to write that all out. 4 is a statement of the type of operation, IFR or VFR. In our case, it'll always be IFR. And number 5 is minimum fuel supply. And if it were an ETOPS flight, then it would need to be the ETOPS diversion time for which the flight is dispatched. That ETOPS diversion time that it's referring to there is that DPA thing that we were talking about earlier. But it has to be an ETOPS flight in the first place to have it. So really, most standard releases are just the 5 items that we already talked about. So that's one of those 7 or 8, though. This is one of those questions that you'll get asked. The dispatch, it'll just ask you what 5 things must be on a dispatch release. That's what the question will normally be. And tail number, flight number, all airports intended to use, type of operation, minimum fuel supply.
And the weather reports and forecasts are included as
They don't need to be on the actual release.
As far as convenience.
Well, we'll read in just a second what they have. They do have to be there, but they don't have to be actually on the release.
There's a memory aid for that. It's Gamut, so it's your destination, departure, or, all the airport, then a type of, so that's the IFR, VFR. I can't remember how to state that one. Then your minimum fuel supply, identification number, and trip number. So that's how you can remember it. Just so you know. It helped me.
I think that, I don't know if I've ever heard the damn it one, but I know I've heard a different one. I just can't remember
That's
what it is.
the dispatcher's office taught me.
The what one?
Damn it.
At our office?
In our office, yeah.
I've never heard that one. But there was one that I learned years ago, but I can't remember what it is now. So, like it says in here, a dispatch release may be in any form, literally any form. So, if they whipped out a napkin and a pencil and you told them on the phone, hey, your tail number, this is your tail number, this is your flight number, this is your origin, destination, alternate, and it's IFR, and this is your minimum fuel, then that would be a valid dispatch release, believe it or not. Yeah, sometimes you believe it or not, it actually comes into play sometimes. I mean, it's very rare, but I don't know if it was a napkin, but it was probably like a piece of paper or something that he was at an airport where he was about to time out. ACAR's NOCOM station. We were on the phone. I couldn't send it to the printer. If he literally waited for them to go print it inside and bring it out, it was going to be, or it might have even been a situation where it wasn't coming up. They couldn't get it to print. You guys have heard most of these. But he wanted to go and he wanted to get out of there, and I said, okay, well, you can just write it down. Then, we can just, if you got something to write with, I'll just give you the 5 items. And I just gave him the 5 items, and off he went. So it wasn't a problem. The next little paragraph there will answer Braden's question. The dispatch release must contain or have attached to it weather reports, available weather forecasts, or a combination thereof for the destination airport, intermediate, and alternate airports that are the latest available at the time the release is signed by the pilot in command and dispatcher. It may include any additional available weather reports or forecasts that the pilot in command or the aircraft dispatcher considers necessary or desirable. So this is that weather packet. If you remember when I was talking about the Great Lakes thing, like where we would send the release for like 3 flights, and then at each outstation we just gave them a new weather packet. It's because the weather packet doesn't need to be on the release, and so we would just give them a new weather packet at each. So the weather it can be on the release if you want. At SkyWest it is on the release, but it doesn't have to be. It can just be attached to it in packet form or whatever you want. It doesn't have to be on the release. It's not one of the 5 items. You can have it separate, you can have it on it, your choice, but you do have to have it. So however they get it is fine. Now, in our case, they can pull up weather on ACARS and everything else, so all of that counts as well. We don't actually need to have it in paper form either, because our pilots can bring it up on ACARS and they can see it right on their screen, and that counts. So as far as when it says current weather, obviously the current weather when we send the release is not the current weather when they actually leave the gate. You know, there's going to be a new METAR, potentially a new TAF, but they can bring it up on their ACARS. So we don't necessarily need to send the new weather unless the TAF changed and needed an alternate or something like that, an amendable situation. But yeah, just remember those 5 things. This next part, disposition of load manifest, dispatch release, and flight plan. So this says, the pilot in command of an airplane shall carry in the airplane to its destination a copy of the completed load manifest, a copy of the dispatch release, and a copy of the flight plan. The airline keeps copies of those records required in this section for at least 3 months. This is another one of those FARs. You'll be asked, what must the pilot in command carry with him on the aircraft to its destination? And that's going to be dispatch release, flight plan, load manifest. So all of those things are different. Like the flight plan also does not need to be on the dispatch release. He has to have a copy of it somehow, either digitally or on a separate paper. Now in our case, like I said, just like the weather, the flight plan is also on our releases at SkyWest, but once again, not one of the 5 required items. It can just be separate or in some other format as long as he has the flight plan somehow. When they do their ACARS initialization, the flight plan that the dispatcher created automatically pops up on their ACARS for them. So then the load manifest, obviously, that's something that they complete in the plane anyway. They get the CLR report as well as the passenger index card from the flight attendant. They get both of those items, and then they do their manifest on the ACARS, and the ACARS is their manifest. Unless they're doing a manual one, then they whip out that piece of paper that we've been doing in class and do it that way and just keep a copy of that. But if they do it on ACARS, then ACARS electronically stores it at headquarters, but the ACARS is the manifest. It's digitally on there. They don't have a physical copy of it. But those are the 3 things that the pilot shall carry in the airplane to its destination. Completed load manifest, copy of the dispatch release, copy of the flight plan. Now, when you say the dispatch release, remember that that also means that it has the weather. The weather will be with the dispatch release, either attached to it or on it. So when you say dispatch release, it already includes weather and NOTAMs. Because the weather also, even though it didn't say it in the FAR, includes NOTAMs as well. Communication. Each certificate holder conducting domestic or flag operations shall record each en route radio contact between the certificate holder and its pilots and shall keep that record for at least 30 days. So when you talk on ACARS, or if you do a Delta radio call or an AirRink radio call, those transcripts are stored at SkyWest for 30 days. So all ACARS conversations are stored for 30 days, so everybody knows. And in perfect timing, that is the end of 121. Any questions on any of it? The big ones, just so you guys know, the big ones really out of all the FARs, 1, 2, 3 rule. So 1, 2, 3 rule. Factors for computing fuel. Dispatch release contents. Required fuel supply. let's see, the the operational control, like the dispatcher sole responsibilities, joint responsibilities. Then this one here, the one that what the pilot has to carry with him on the airplane to the destination. Those are really the what is that, 5 or 6 or 7? Those are the real big ones that you pretty much are guaranteed to get questioned on. So. Yep, that should be it.